next agenda item, the first agenda item tonight is public comments. Do we have anyone sign up for public comments today? No? All right. Next agenda item is additions, deletions, and approval of agenda. Anyone have anything to add or delete? Sure. Good. All right, can I get a motion to approve the agenda? Michael? Can I get a second? Second. All in favor? Thank you. All right, next item is going to be approval of minutes. I do have one thing on the minutes, Cheryl. Under section 7, you have a minimum of 25 acres on the second paragraph. I believe it was a minimum of 20 acres or 25. Anybody else have any other things? Anything else about the minutes? Can I get a motion?
I did.
All right. Motion to approve the minutes. All right, can I get a second? Second. Thank you. All in favor? Thank you. All right, and the next agenda items are presentation of solar generating facilities. So, Deb, would you mind introducing our guest?
Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to thank Mike Davis for helping and assisting, and tonight would be possible if not for Mike. He's the Director of Membership with the North Carolina Sustainable Energy Association, which is a nonprofit dedicated to driving public policy and market development in order to create clean energy jobs, economic opportunities, and affordable energy options that will benefit all North Carolinians. And his association has developed solar template ordinance, which we have received, and a number of North Carolina municipalities and counties have adopted some of those in some form or the other. So we reached out to Mr. Davis and asked him for assistance in looking up our own ordinance, and he in turn arranged to have our speaker, Steve Calland. And Mr. Calland is the Executive Director of the North Carolina Clean Energy Technology Center at NC State in Raleigh. He's very versed in solar energy and policy, as one of his responsibilities at the center is to direct public policy for clean energy. He has more than 25 years of experience in the field of renewable energy and energy efficiency, and serves on the board of directors of the North Carolina Sustainable Energy Association. He's also on the advisory board of the Research Triangle Clean Tech Cluster and the Environmental and Energy Study Institute based in Washington, D.C. If I listed all of his experiences and his service in that industry, he wouldn't have time to talk to the board. So on that, I would thank you very much for coming all the way from Raleigh to help us and give us some of your knowledge. So, like you said.
So, if it's okay, I may pace a little bit, and unfortunately I can only connect this in a way that makes it show up behind y'all. Is that all right?
That's right, yeah.
Okay. So, yeah, my name is Steve Calland. I am the Executive Director of what's called now the Clean Energy Technology Center. Anybody a state grad? Oh, well, okay. Two of you there? If you were state grad, you may remember the North Carolina Solar Center, or the Solar House on campus, which was built. The Solar House was built all the way back in 1981. The Solar Center was founded in '88. We are the Solar Center. We changed our name because we do a lot of other stuff now. We do wind and electric vehicles and energy efficiency and this, that, and the other. Basically, everybody on staff got mad at me every time I said we were the Solar Center and they did something other than solar, so we eventually changed our name. But we've been around for a good long while at this point. We do work in renewable energy, clean power and energy efficiency in the industrial setting in particular, so we do a lot of work with industrial facilities, combined heat and power, or cogeneration, you may have heard it called before. We do a lot of work in the clean transportation sector, so electric vehicles, biofuel vehicles, propane and gas vehicles. So we've done work with natural gas garbage trucks and electric buses and you name it, that kind of thing. We do work in green building as well. And then one thing that we learned over time, even though we're in the College of Engineering, is that nothing in the world of energy really particularly gets very well done unless you can kind of bring three legs of the stool together. You really have to have the economics piece, the technology piece, and the policy piece. The policy piece kind of sets the framework for the market. I stood over here so that they could see me as well. The policy piece kind of sets the market framework. The economics is, if it doesn't make economic sense, nobody's going to do it anyway. And you have to have the technology working. in order to be able to get something useful done. And so really that's what our center is about. I happen to be a policy guy. I've been running the center since the, I guess the mid-2000s. But we have engineering staff, we have MBAs, we have a whole bunch of folks that do programmatic work to help run all of our programs. We have a staff of around 20 folks that work on these issues all the time. I will say that unlike a nonprofit organization like Mike's, we're not a membership-based organization. We don't have companies that are members of our organization. So we don't have a particular axe to grind one way or the other. I will admit we're not the clean coal center, so we do have at least a little bit of a slant that we think that clean energy is a useful thing for the state. But we're not particularly biased to any company or any particular outcome on this. Our job really is part of the North Carolina State Extension Service. We're not part of CALS, we're part of engineering, but our job is part of that extension mission of the university to help get good information out into the hands of decision makers in the state of North Carolina so that you guys can do your jobs. Because it's always hard if nobody can give you any good information to work with. Let's see if I can make my clicker work here. I cannot make my clicker work here. Up one.
Oops.
It started working. All right. There we go. It just needed to catch up for a second. So just real quick, I want to talk a little bit about what we're talking about here. I get a lot of questions about exactly what is solar. There's lots and lots of different kinds of solar. There's passive solar design. This state has a whole lot of actually passive solar design homes from the 1970s. People that built homes to take advantage of natural daylight. They oriented the house to be able to capture that light and absorb it in thermal mass and heat their homes with it. The solar house at NC State, we have an annual heating bill in that building of $35 because of the way we designed the building so that you can absorb that heat and use it. But passive solar is not as commonly found these days. There's also solar thermal panels. That's the technology that you heard a lot about back in the Jimmy Carter era and up into more recent times as well. Unfortunately, we don't see as much of the solar thermal as we used to. It's a great technology. It's very bulletproof. It's relatively inexpensive, but natural gas is a lot less expensive. And so solar thermal has a tough time competing against natural gas. That said, if you like solar thermal, I'd love to talk to you about it because it's one of my favorite technologies and I've worked with it off and on for years and years. This thing right here in the middle picture, this is an industrial scale solar thermal system. They call that a power tower. It's like a gigantic bug zapper almost. Basically, those are all mirrors, parabolic mirrors focusing light on a central point in the center, and they heat that thing up. I can't remember, it's like 10,000 suns temperature. It's something ridiculously hot. And they use that with a molten salt material that collects that heat. It's one of the few solar technologies that you can make electricity at night with because you can store that heat for so long that you can generate steam all night long from that. Unfortunately, you gotta have basically no cloud cover to make that work, so that's not really a North Carolina option. So we don't see those here, but they're out there. This one down below it, this is a different kind of the same general principle. This is a parabolic trough collector, and there's a little tube that runs down the center of that and collects that same kind of heat. Not quite as hot as the bug zapper one, but up there. But what we're primarily talking about are photovoltaics, which is this one up here at the top, and that's solar electric technology. It basically works through a chemical process to convert sunlight into electricity. I'm a policy guy. I'm guessing, is there anybody in the room that's a chemist or a physicist? If not, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about how it works, but let's just say it works. It does. Solar electric, though, one of the neat things about that technology is that it is very, very modular, very, very robust. About 20 years before I got into solar, the people that were working in this industry were primarily people that were working on ways to power satellites because we couldn't run the extension cords that far. And so this is a technology that started really to be able to create power literally in outer space. By the time I got in, I was working with guys that had been in this, and there were really two major markets for solar. We used batteries back in those days, old submarine batteries, lead acid batteries, and you had basically pot growers in Northern California that didn't want to get found by their electric bill, and militias in southern Idaho that didn't want to get found by their electric bill. So depending on the day of the week, you either had camo or tie-dye in the trunk of the car, and just depending on what the sales visit was. It's one of those things where the politics kind of, go far enough out on the spectrum and the circle kind of comes back together again. So that was where this industry really got its start. But over time, what has happened is that the technology has gotten cheaper and cheaper. One of the neat things about solar technologies is that it is very much the whole Henry Ford thing. The more you build, the cheaper they get. And that's what we've seen. We've seen incremental improvement in the technology. We've seen a lot of scale of increased use of the technology, and those two things have really helped to drive that down. Put it in context of that policy framework we were talking about, the economics have worked and they've gotten better and better, and so now we see a lot of it. So the largest solar market in the United States is California, but a lot of people don't realize that the second largest solar market in the United States is actually North Carolina. Now, that is a very different market than California. In California, they have what I would call a much more balanced market. You see a lot of residential solar in California on rooftops. In fact, if you go to buy a new home in California now, they've recently passed something in the building code there that says that you have to build new homes with solar on it. So you go in, you pick out your countertops, you pick out your appliances, you pick out your solar panels. Commercial systems, bigger systems, but still on these rooftops, we don't see as many of those in this area as we do out in California either. It's all about scale. They've got so much larger scale in California even than we do, even as the second largest solar market in the world, and they've been at it a lot longer in terms of developing policy, that you see a lot more of that part of the market develop there. There are other parts of the country, including just to the south of us. South Carolina has a lot going on in the rooftop market because they've put policies in place to encourage that. North Carolina had much more of a free market approach to this. We created something back in 2007 called a Renewable Energy Portfolio Standard, and we said, we want a chunk of the energy from this state to come from renewable energy resources, but we're not going to say how you get there. And so basically we said, within that chunk, let the market do it, and what we wound up with was a lot of this what we call utility scale solar. All right, where am I clicking? We'll just go with this one. So this again shows that scale. So you can see California has 17 gigawatts of solar. That's 17 nuclear power plants. A gigawatt's roughly one nuclear power plant. Now let me caveat that very heavily here. Nuclear power plant runs about 95% of the time. Solar panels run about 20% of the time. So it may be 17 nuclear power plants operating at 1/5 capacity. It's still a lot of energy. But without storage, you've got to shift that energy around. So it's not 17 nuclear power plants, but it's a whole lot of solar. North Carolina, that's a 2017 slide, was at about 3 gigawatts then. We're a little over 4 gigawatts now and climbing. Because of some legislation that passed last year, we expect to cross about 6.5, almost 7 gigawatts over the next 4 years if everything goes according to plan. So we will still be in probably the top 4 or 5 in the country if everything continues down the path we're on now. Boy, this clicker is not liking me tonight. When you look at, yeah, there's Davidson. That's one of the earlier projects in the state, right? That's what they look like out in the field. You can see that there's rows of these panels. It's fairly pervious structure. You can see the dirt underneath it. A lot of times they'll have some sort of grass grow in there to keep it from eroding, or clover or something, and we'll talk more about that in a second. But when you look at where the projects have gone, they've gone all over the state. But what you can see, the size of this circle, and by the way, thank you to NCSEA because this is their data that I'm using right here. They maintain an excellent database of where all the projects are. The little tiny circles are primarily residential projects, and you can see they kind of cluster around the metro areas. Charlotte, here's Asheville, here's the Triangle, the Triad, a little bit down in Wilmington. As the systems get a little bit bigger, you can see industrial sites or commercial systems that tend to be, larger commercial buildings that are out in certain areas, a lot of warehouses, frankly. And then these really large ones are the biggest of the utility scale projects. And you see that the vast majority of this happened pretty much between the Triangle and about one county off the coast where property gets too expensive. There's a lot of activity out there. It's because the land's flat, the land's cheap. It's been a good place to do solar, but it's created a little bit of an imbalance in the state. That's all the old Duke Energy progress grid. And what we're seeing is that Duke Energy has a lot of interest in trying to balance this equation out a little bit and get a little bit more into the old Duke Energy grid, which is up in y'all's neck of the woods here. And so we're going to start to see a lot more effort of pushing projects in this direction. And if I had to guess, the area between about here and the Triad is where a lot of that attention is going to focus, and I think it's going to be a lot more complicated because obviously the land's a lot more expensive. There's a lot more competition for what to do with that land than there was down east. Some of those counties down east, they haven't built a gas station in 30 years. So it was a big boom to those counties. Here, you've got competing uses, and those are going to be questions that are going to come before planning board. So something y'all are going to have to probably deal with as things move forward. All right, I'm going to lose all of my time just doing that if I'm not careful. Maybe I'll just sit down and do this manually, it'd be a little easier. Since my clicker apparently hates me. All right, so this didn't happen for no reason. As I mentioned, there were policy drivers that kind of drove a lot of this. We used to have a big state tax credit in North Carolina for solar. It had dated all the way back to the 1970s. It was changed several times. It was expanded in terms of the amount, the total cap of tax credit that you could take once or twice, but it's expired. It doesn't exist anymore. It went out in 2015, so there is no longer a state tax credit. There is a federal tax credit, about 30% of the system cost, but it's on a downward slide right now. And so starting next year, it's going to drop. I believe it drops next year to 20%. It eventually gets all the way down to 10% for commercial systems only by 2022. Residential goes away altogether. There's a third thing that's crossed out up there. That's this fixed year, 15-year fixed price utility power purchase agreements. That's a little complicated to explain, but it made working with the electric utilities a lot easier in terms of pricing, but that's gone away as well because of legislation that passed last summer, so that incentive is now gone. I mentioned the Renewable Energy Portfolio Standard from 2007, which had a little carve-out. Back in 2007, solar was about 5 to 7 times the price of wind and natural and landfill gas and other renewables technologies, so we thought we'd have the biggest trouble getting more solar. There's a whole lot of reasons for why it happened, but it really came down to the Chinese decided they wanted to own the global solar market, and they started dumping solar panels in the market, and it dropped panels during the Great Recession at a ridiculous rate. We had 80% price drop in solar panel prices in 1 year at one point. It's continued to be between 50 and 70% a year drops consistently now for going on 6-7 years. And so solar prices have come down dramatically. And so all of a sudden, this renewable portfolio standard that we put a carve out of 0.2% of the whole state's energy supply had to come from solar. Well, we kind of blew through that in about a year and a half. And so now they're almost, the whole 12.5% of the renewable portfolio standard, almost all of it is going to wind up coming from solar in the end because it's become the cheapest resource of all the options. You have a question?
Are we down to $1 a watt yet?
So we are well under $1 a watt for the panels. Installed system costs, we're in that neighborhood right now, and that's part of the Department of Energy's efforts is to try and get the whole thing down there. But it depends a lot on the scale of the system, what technology you're using. So there's a lot of different pieces to answer that question. But solar panels themselves are, as a component of a utility scale project, are well under $1 a watt at this point. The last one is the one that's really still on the books and the one that causes a lot of local governments to have some questions, and that's this 80% property tax abatement. That also dates back to the Jimmy Carter era. It's actually 100%, believe it or not, for solar thermal systems. But solar thermal systems tend to be a lot smaller and on buildings. And 80% property tax abatement on these large utility scale projects means that you get a pretty significant benefit if you're building one of these large solar farms. Note that that is on the equipment, though, not on the land. And so it's an 80% property tax abatement on the, I have to get this right, it's not the real, it's the personal property tax side. And I'll talk more about that later. But these were the drivers that really got us to where we are. If you're interested in learning about the solar incentives as they currently stand, up in that top corner you see www.desire.usa. It's missing the first E. Please be very careful typing that into the web. Desire is kind of a sketchy word to use in web browsers, but that's the database for state incentives for renewables and efficiency. It's a database we run, and it's got all the information on all the incentives in the United States, including in North Carolina at the federal, state, local government, and individual utility level down to a certain size. We can only do, I think, utilities down to 50,000 customers. But it gives you a lot of stuff to look at if you're interested. So last summer, again, largely thanks to the efforts of the North Carolina Sustainable Energy Association and another group called the North Carolina Clean Energy Business Alliance, which is a trade association, so a C6 rather than a C3 like NCSEA. They worked together with industry and passed a new bill that Duke Energy worked very closely with them on that really changed the whole game in North Carolina. As I mentioned, the biggest impact of this from the utility scale side is it's going to shift development from the eastern part of the state more to the western part of the state. There are a lot of other things that fall out of this bill. There's going to be a discussion of, there's a rebate program that's come along for rooftop programs. So you're going to see in very, very short spurts, because the rebate program is tiny and it gets filled up. I think the residential part of the rebate program was fully subscribed in less than a day. I believe the commercial rebate program was fully subscribed for the year in under 2 weeks. There may still be some nonprofit money out there actually for rebates on the commercial building, which would include government buildings, by the way. If you can find somebody to bring into the deal to take the tax credit. We can talk more about that if somebody's interested. It's complicated. But at any rate, so there's more interest in the rooftop market because of this rebate program. That's in there. There's a community solar program, which Duke Energy is still trying to figure out how it's going to work. It's kind of a mid-scale. It's kind of bigger than residential and commercial rooftops, but not as big as utility scale. There is a program in there specifically for businesses that want to purchase renewable energy. It's the Green Source Rider program. It's now called Green Source Advantage, and it's basically designed to allow, if Apple wants to purchase a bunch of renewable energy to offset the use of their data center, that they can do that. All of these things were a part of this larger bill, but the biggest thing that it did was it shifted the energy from the utility scale projects further to the west, and it also got rid of that PERPA thing that I was talking about, that 15-year fixed price contract. And replaced it with what's going to be an RFP process. So Duke is going to periodically put a bid out looking for solar projects. There's a lot more details on that. If you guys want details, we can talk more about that as we go here. I'm trying to talk real fast because I got more slides than I probably should for you. Just real quick, one last thing on the history of how we got here. This is just a graph. If you go all the way down to the far end, the tiny little blue dots, that's 1911. That was the renewable energy in North Carolina. That's hydropower. All the blue is hydropower. You can see in the Great Depression, you can see the TVA hydro projects in Western North Carolina coming in and trying to create jobs and create electrification in that part of the state. And that went on for a while. You can see in the 40s and 50s, the brown starting to come in. That's biomass energy. That's a lot of pulp and paper mills and textile mills bringing in bioenergy, basically burning a lot of waste product on site and creating electricity with it. Some of those projects were out there. You have to get all the way up there to 2008, the year after that REPS, Renewable Portfolio Standard, passed, when you can first start to see yellow dots. And if you go like 6 years further down the road, you see that the yellow suddenly is bigger than all the rest of it combined. That's how fast the solar revolution in North Carolina happened. And that's why we're going through a lot of these questions, is that there were a lot of policymakers that were caught a little bit off guard by this. Frankly, there was a lot of everybody that was caught a little bit off guard by this. And so we didn't have a lot of time to grow into it. The good news is that the way it was structured in North Carolina, we had a lot of projects, but they were at the time huge, 5 megawatt projects, 35 to 50 acres. But in the scheme of where things are today, those are very small projects. I was just up in Virginia a couple of weeks ago. There's a project going in, it's 500 megawatts. They've got a little over 6,000 acres under control for the project in Spotsylvania County. It is unbelievable how large it is. So if we think we have land use issues in this state with the scale of projects that we've been dealing with up to this point now, there are neighboring states that are going to have much bigger sticker shock as this moves forward. I will say that we are also seeing this trend in North Carolina. It's another side effect of this law that passed last summer, is a lot of the incentive to see these smaller projects in the 5 megawatt range has gone away, and so we're seeing more 20 megawatt, 30, 40 megawatt, 80 megawatt projects. I think the largest I've heard in North Carolina at this point is 100 megawatts. If you figure it's roughly 5 to 7 acres in the flatlands for 1 megawatt. As you get out here and you've got more roll to the hill, there may be a little bit, a slightly larger number of acres per megawatt, but it's just a rule of thumb to give you some sense as to how much land you might be talking about. So you're going to see larger projects as they come out this direction, and you're going to probably see people trying to assemble larger tracts of land across multiple landowners to try and put these kinds of projects together, because the biggest driver in solar right now is economies of scale. So that's kind of how we got there. And it was great if you were a solar developer, but obviously it led to lots of questions, a lot of legitimate questions from policymakers in particular that were trying to figure out exactly what they needed to be worried about. And it also created a whole lot of questions that showed up on the internet that I really have gotten a headache over, that gave me a lot of indigestion. Questions like, will my dog explode from electromagnetic fields if I walk it too close to the fence line? Or
will it?
the answer is no. Let's just say there was an amazing array. We got made fun of on shows like, you know, some of the Comedy Central shows because people were saying things in public hearings and someone would pick it up and it would eventually make its way to the national news. And then I would inevitably be standing in the audience while they were like making fun of us on national television. So we've had to clear up some of those issues. And really that's where we got involved. You know, we had a lot of local governments. I mean, people that have not dealt with this stuff, it's not their fault that they've not dealt with it. They don't know what they don't know. If somebody asked me, like, you know, if somebody asked me how to, you know, do nuclear particle physics, which is what my boss does, by the way, I would have no clue how to do that either. So, you know, what we've been doing as a center is trying to help out with local policymakers to kind of separate things that are real issues that do really need to be considered, and most of those are going to be pretty obvious to y'all because that's what y'all do for a living, but also help you kind of figure out which things were kind of red herring issues that you might find on the internet, but there's not a lot of basis for it, and therefore you probably don't have as much to worry about on those fronts. That doesn't mean you don't have citizens or neighbors or whoever that are absolutely concerned about it. But what we want to do is give you the information that you can share with them so that they can understand that that's not something that they need to worry about. And I'm going to walk through some of that for you here real quick. And then I've got a couple of handouts that I think everybody got. If you didn't get them in the audience, I think there's some on the back table there.
And Steve, sorry to interrupt, but I also put some fact sheets back there specifically about what Steve's talking about, some of the myths and facts related to health impacts and things like that. So be sure to pick those up, and we've got those digitally as well.
Yeah, and this is all on our website if you need to download it or email it to someone as well. But I always bring hard copies because I can never find them on my website sometimes, so it's just easier to hand them out. But all that said, these are basically synthesis papers where we've gone out and looked at the literature on various topics and looked at scholarly literature, cited literature from real journals, not the local club's journal that cites the club in the next county's journal to get a citation for it. We're trying to get academic literature together on these topics so that we can actually have good fact-based information to talk about these issues. And so we've done a lot of education and assistance. I can tell you this started with the white papers, then it went to, can you come and talk to us? And so I've done, I think, about 45 of these just in North Carolina alone now. I've done a bunch in Virginia as well through support from something called the Energy Foundation. And then I've worked with groups in South Carolina and Georgia on it as well. So I've done a lot of these at this point. You start with this discussion of why are we even talking about this? What are the benefits of renewables? And there's some obvious economic potential benefits from renewables. There is this economic development component, particularly in eastern North Carolina. As I mentioned, there's a lot of counties where there just hasn't been a lot of economic development, and it's been a real boon for them. One thing I always try to make clear is there is jobs benefit, but these are construction jobs. And so I never want anybody to oversell in the utility scale side of solar the jobs benefit of solar. There are jobs, and it's actually, right now I think the solar industry nationally employs about 5 times more people than the coal industry does. It is a huge industry. And in North Carolina, Mike, I don't know if you know what the current census numbers are off the top of your head, but I think it comes up later in my talk, but there's probably 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 jobs just in North Carolina in solar, just in the utility scale for the most part side of this.
7,600 jobs according to the Solar Foundation.
So, and almost all of those are in the utility scale side, and that's everybody from guys that are humping panels off the back of trucks and bolting them to racks, to lawyers and bankers that are putting the deals together, and a whole lot of engineering folks in between. So there's a lot of jobs in the industry, but the real jobs in solar come when you get to the next piece, when you get to the rooftop pieces, because then we're going to have plumbers and electricians and roofers that also do solar. And when we do our training, we focus on those kinds of folks because that market doesn't exist yet. I don't want to train a bunch of solar installers and have them standing around waiting for the industry to evolve. I want to train a bunch of plumbers, electricians, and roofers and folks like that so that when that market emerges, they're ready for it. And so that's a big focus of the work that we do. But that's where the real jobs, the bigger jobs come from, is when that part of the market emerges. And it's starting to in North Carolina. The second big benefit is this property tax discussion. Even with that 80% property tax income abatement, most of this land that's getting used is in what used to be called, what's called the PUV program. I assume you guys have some of this down here, the present use. Is that what it's called? I want to say it's not present, but at any rate, it's the agricultural discount for land, right? And so it's discounted in the way that it's assessed for property tax purposes. When solar gets put on that land, it usually comes out of the PUV program, which means that the assessed value, the basis for assessment of that land goes up. It's usually a factor of between 2 and 4 times increase in value, so you're going to get more property tax revenue collected from that. I will tell you, if you're a landowner and you're working with a developer and the developer is not paying that delta in property tax, you have a very bad lawyer. The developer almost always pays that delta. No landowner should get stuck paying that. I'll just say that, and if there's a developer in the room, they can throw things at me later. So there's that benefit, but then you still get 20% of the equipment, the personal property tax side. And when you're talking about tens of millions of dollars over 20 years, that gets to be something fairly significant. So there's a net value to a lot of these communities on the property tax side, and I'll show you some of the early numbers that we've been collecting from a few key counties on that in a minute. And then the landowners get some revenue diversification out of it. A lot of times in the farm areas of the state, the landowners have been struggling with this, and every time a hurricane rolls in or we have a bad drought season or whatever it might be, farming just gets hard. I don't like it as much as an NC State guy when farmers take all of their property and put it into solar, but it's their choice. Who am I to tell them what to do? But one of the nice things that I hear is a lot of farmers think of this as their 401k plan. They can put a part of their land into this and they got a steady revenue stream that comes from a lease payment for 25 years, and they know exactly what they're going to get, and that allows them to have the luxury of farming the way they used to farm the rest of the land. Not every farmer does that. Some farmers take the whole shooting match and put it in there. But it gives them that choice and that opportunity for diversification. There's all the other kind of stuff that you hear about renewable energy, clean energy. It helps with cleaner air and water and reduced environmental risk. There's no coal ash that comes out of solar panels. There's no greenhouse gases that come out of solar panels. I don't want to dwell on all that stuff because in North Carolina, nobody seems to care, so why bother? But in general, there are environmental benefits associated with solar. The other thing that's nice about it is that it does have this energy security and resilience issue. Somebody was asking me about this before we started. There was a big discussion about how did the solar farms do during the hurricanes. All these farms I showed you that were down east when the floods came in. Well, I saw all these news reports about how, the solar company was saying, we had 13 panels out of 10,000 panels that were broken, so it wasn't a big deal. We didn't even declare it to an insurance company because it wasn't worth the trouble. And that, I saw repeated reports of this, and then all of a sudden I'm out in California at a conference, and this Twitter thing hits my notes, and it says 1/3 of the solar projects in the state went down because of the hurricanes, and it was from Duke. Now, I love Duke, and I work with Duke all the time, but I looked into it, and it turns out that a lot of those projects that went down because of the hurricane were because the wires were down on one end or the other of the solar project. It wasn't because of the solar project, it was because Duke's wires were down. So I had a little discussion with Randy over at Duke, and he did correct his tweet eventually to identify what the source was. So the solar projects tend to actually be very resilient. The wind project, if you remember my chart where I showed all those colors, there were 2 little green dots on the very last 2 years. That's that giant Amazon wind farm up in the northeast corner of the state. It also came out of the project with no significant damage. So these technologies are very resilient. They don't need to have fuel. You maybe remember a few years ago if you were up in the mountains when we had the hurricane rolling in the Gulf and you couldn't get gas up in Asheville for a couple of weeks. We don't have those kinds of problems with solar and wind either. It's already here, so it makes it easy. So there's lots of benefits to renewables, but it's not always a slam dunk. Now I mentioned these reports. You guys already have copies of these. Where I get concerns are in these 4 major areas usually. The health and safety stuff, and I'll walk through this a little bit. I get a lot of land use questions and land impact questions. The aesthetics issues, some of which there are answers for and some of which are going to find their way into the planning board's discussion. and then these local economic and regulatory issues. So to the best of my ability, I'm going to move through these relatively quickly and just touch on what we've got here. So the first one that I hear a lot about is toxicity. People are worried that solar panels are in some way, shape, or form going to pollute the groundwater. The reality is they just don't. There's nothing in a solar panel that is in any way going to pollute the groundwater, even if it sits in a landfill for 35 years. There's a test that the EPA runs. It's called the EPA Toxicity Characteristic Leaching Protocol Test. They basically take solar panels, grind them up into little pieces, throw them in an acid bath to simulate 30 years in a landfill, and then test what comes out. And the EPA has no problem with you landfilling solar panels. I have a problem with it. I'd much rather see them get recycled when they're done. That's a whole different discussion. But there's nothing from a toxicity standpoint. Every now and then somebody calls out this one particular solar company, First Solar. They use a different type of material. So most solar panels are made from what we call silicon. Some of you may know that as, kind of sand. It's the same stuff that goes into a lot of computer chips. Silicon is completely inert. It's like not a problem at all. Cadmium telluride is the material used by this company, First Solar, out of Ohio. They're one of the few U.S. manufacturers. They do manufacture all over the world, but they're U.S. based and they've got manufacturing plants here. Cadmium is kind of a nasty thing by itself. But when you make cadmium telluride, you've kind of fixed it in a stable way. Think of it like salt. You've got chlorine in salt. Well, chlorine ain't real great either. But once you've made it into salt, you can't really easily go back to chlorine in the environment. It's the same general idea with cadmium telluride. So these solar panels that are made from First Solar are also accepted by the EPA to be landfilled. There are no real issues with that. That said, First Solar has a program where they basically make you sign in blood that when you use their panels at the end of their lifespan, or if you break them on site while you're installing them, they get them back as part of a recycling program they've got, because the cheapest source of cadmium telluride for them is cadmium telluride panels. So they've already got a recycling program in place. We're going to see a lot more recycling emerge in this country as more panels become available, but this is one of those things that's already out there. The other big components of a solar farm, inverters. That's the thing that takes the DC electricity and flips it to AC electricity, which is what comes out of your wall. The biggest question that I get about inverters are, is there any kind of chemical process there that's dangerous? The answer is no. That ROHS is a European standard, but all of the inverters are made and pass a protocol associated with that, make sure that they are completely safe from a landfill perspective as well. And so you really don't have any concerns there. Transformers is the third piece. Sometimes people used to worry about transformers having PCBs in them. PCBs were phased out 35, 40 years ago at this point. They all use mineral or vegetable oil. They're completely safe these days as well. You'll note that last bullet, batteries. Very rare so far. I wrote that slide 6 months ago. They're getting more common. Batteries are a little bit of a discussion. We don't have a lot of good information about batteries yet. I told you how fast the price of solar was dropping. Believe it or not, batteries prices right now are dropping faster. And so we're going to see a lot of batteries. And it's because not just are they getting used in solar at your house, they're getting used by utilities for big utility scale projects. They're getting used in all these cars that are either hybrid electric or plug-in electric. And so all of a sudden the demand for batteries globally has shot through the ceiling, and the scale is massive, and we're seeing more and more batteries come out. Batteries will be fine because we went through this with solar 2 decades ago. We developed standards through Underwriters Labs, UL, the guys that put the little stickers on your lamp. We have IEEE, which is the Institute for Electrical Engineering, blah, blah, blah. I can't remember what it stands for, but they do all the stuff that kind of connects stuff from one end to the grid, and then the National Electric Code, NEC. And so there's NEC 690, UL 1741, and IEEE 1547. And those are the three numbers that utilities basically make you deal with those codes and standards whenever you're using photovoltaics. Basically, local governments don't even have to worry about that part because no utility will allow you to do anything if you're not compliant with those standards. Unfortunately, in the battery side, those standards are all in draft form, and there's about 75 of them. So we're still working through that process. A lot of those standards will get collapsed into fewer standards. A lot of those standards will eventually get finalized, and then we won't have that problem. What I can't tell you today, and what I spent 2 weeks out in California trying to figure out is, are there 3 or 4 standards I could point you to now The answer is no, but I'm talking with Duke Energy and I'm hoping that they're gonna put together something that basically says this is what they're gonna require for storage, and then you don't have to do anything other than say, do what Duke said. And once we have codes and standards, this was the problem with PV. Back in the days when solar was first coming on, Duke wasn't overly excited about anybody generating on their own because that meant they weren't selling you electrons. And so the goalposts that kind of went with how the standards for PV went kept kind of moving. But once we got them standardized and in place and everybody accepted them, the goalposts stopped moving. So I'm a little worried about the goalposts moving in the short run, but once we get the standards in place, that problem will go away. In the short run, Duke and the munis and the co-ops are all great partners. They want to see this stuff because they actually want to use it themselves. And so we're working through that right now. So keep that in mind.
Question.
Yes, sir.
Is the storage typically on property where the panels are, or is it?
There's lots of different ways of doing it. Much like the PV, it's very modular. You know, you can have a battery in your watch, or you can have a tractor trailer with a bunch of batteries that were reclaimed from old Priuses that are 10 years old but still had life if you strung them all together, and they put those out at a substation.
I'm just asking from a planning and zoning perspective, whether the rules should be different if they're going to store the power on site versus storing the power off site.
Well, I think the issue is that you're going to want to have knowledge of where the batteries are, and the answers are going to depend a little bit on where they are, what kind of batteries they are, how they're being used, and how they're packaged. And I don't want to create fear about that because there's very smart people working through that, and they won't, and the utilities are not going to let anybody do anything unsafe. So I'm not worried about it. I just don't know what the answer is to tell you yet. And sometimes that's just the way it works, right? It takes a while to get to that answer.
And we'll likely revise the template ordinance to address batteries.
Yeah, in fact, that model template ordinance that Mike's referring to, we are scheduled to try and have some discussions about how to revise that this spring. That's one of the major reasons that we're doing it, is to try and figure out what kind of guidance language we can come up with around batteries at this point. So, sorry you guys are a little bit ahead of that curve, but you may want to relook at that sometime in the spring if we get that far, for what it's worth. I'm going to talk faster now, believe it or not. EMF, electromagnetic fields and radiation. There's been a lot of studies about this. There was a big scare many years ago that people were afraid if you were hanging out near power lines, it was causing cancer clusters. The National Science Foundation, the National Academy of Sciences, and about 16 other groups of big scientists all looked at this and could find no linkages whatsoever. There is no significant EMF that comes from a solar farm anyway. There's background EMF in this room and in pretty much all over the environment. And so basically, if you are at the fence line of a solar farm, you are basically at background EMF. The only place you're going to find any significant electromagnetic field in a solar farm is if you happen to go inside and stand in between the inverter and the transformer, which I would not recommend doing because then you're probably in violation of the National Electric Code anyway. But in general, that's the only place where there's any significant amount of EMF, and it reduces to background well before you get to the fence line. So EMF is kind of a non-issue when it comes to solar farms, assuming that they're done according to code. Yeah.
Are the inverters pure sine wave inverters or just standard?
These days, they're all pure sine wave. In fact, they're mostly solid state, so there's none of this. You know, in the old days, it used to be you'd have a bunch of transformers and you'd step and approximate a wave. Yeah, that's all gone. It's all solid state stuff now. So it's all pure sine wave. Electric shock, long and short. If you climb over the fence with the barbed wire at the top and go into the solar farm with a crowbar and pry open the inverter box and put your hand inside and start pulling on wires, you will get shocked. Or if you climb underneath the solar panels and start yanking on wires, you probably will get shocked. However, most of the wires at the end of the rows go buried in the conduit and go underground. They actually tend to bury those conduit at least 3 feet deep so that at decommissioning time, it's below plowing level. So if you were going to return to farmland, you want to be below kind of the area where you'd be plowing. And so there's really not a lot of exposed wire in these sites. And
So
if
they don't take the wires up?
Oh, they usually pull the wires from the tubes, but the conduit may not come out. And that's something that people need to think about. But the wire is too valuable to leave. At decommissioning time, it's all copper or aluminum. Somebody's going to want that for recycling purposes. And I'll talk more about that later. But in general, there's not a lot of exposed wire at these sites, and you have to work pretty hard to hurt yourself from an electric shock standpoint. It's not to say that it can't be done, But that's why we have the National Electric Code and the IEEE standard and the utility safe practices is to avoid that. So as long as everybody's doing what they're supposed to be doing, electric shock is kind of a non-issue. Fire. This was one I had not thought about until somebody raised it. Yes, sir.
Could you go back to the other slide?
Yep.
One of the things we talked about, it says the National Electric Code requires the site to be secured with a 6-foot chain link fence and
Yep.
3 strands of barbed wire, or an 8-foot fence. Right?
Correct.
Sorry. So there is going to be a fence on any solar farm.
If any solar farm will be fenced, it's just a requirement of the code.
Of the code.
Yes, and in order to enter that fence, you have to be, I believe you have to have both, I want to say you have to have, what's it called, the OSHA 10 certification and certain training under the National Electric Code. So in other words, the farmer can't go inside the fence without having been through the training. That's why there are companies out there that do operations and maintenance because they have staff that are trained to go out and do that kind of work. So most projects are locked up in a way that the only people that can get in are the people that are allowed to get in.
What code is the fence regulation?
That's part of the National Electric Code, NEC.
Okay.
And you are visiting multiple sites in the East Coast region. What is the common fence you see? The 6-foot with the barbed wire or the 8-foot?
I don't know that I can say that one is more common than the other. I would say that, it depends a little bit on the screening. So there's a difference between the fencing and the screening, and we'll talk about screening in a little bit.
Okay.
And what you want to look like. Sometimes it's also a decision of the local folks as to what they want to look at. Personally, I think the barbed wire is a little safer. Believe it or not. And the reason is kids climb fences. They don't climb barbed wire.
Okay.
What's the threshold on how large the site has to be before it falls into this fence code?
The size threshold?
Right.
That's a good
So if someone
question.
puts up one solar panel, do they know?
Yeah, no, so it does not apply to a residential or rooftop project. What I'm not sure of, and I can check for you, is if you were mounting it in the ground, if you were doing a ground mount system in your yard, for example, I believe that would not require the fence, but I'm not sure exactly where it triggers the fence. So I can find that out for you. If you can, somebody can keep a list of questions that I need to find the answer to, that would be great. And I'd be happy to check that for you. Yeah, because for example, I know people that have, pole-mounted systems that they've installed themselves in their yard and they do not have a fence around them. In fact, I know somebody that had one of those and had goats in their property, and that was a big mess. So you live and learn, but they self-installed, and so they were not.
Horses, I wouldn't think more
That's a whole other discussion.
Well, the reason I'm asking is if, we have an ordinance that has a fence requirement. Now that I know that NEC ordinance, it is.
Is already there, you don't need that duplicated in essence.
Okay.
And frankly, that's one of the big things I tell folks is a lot of the stuff that comes up is kind of already taken care of. We'll get to like glare in a minute, and I'll talk about that one. There's people worry about, is the glare from the system going to cause a problem? No, but we'll get to that in a second.
Okay.
So fire is another one. I had not really thought about this one until somebody asked me the question. The big issue with fire is there's not a lot really there that burns very well. There's a little bit of plastic in the wire coatings and in the back sheets of the solar panels, but it's just not terribly flammable material. So if fire kind of rolls over a piece of property like this, you might have some ground cover that would burn like anything else, but the PV itself is not a big fire hazard. So fire is not really, a significant issue. And it's also not a likely cause of a fire. All these systems are grounded much the way you would ground any electrical equipment, like a substation or anything else. And so, it's kind of the same general principles of operating from an electrical strike or something like that. And so, and trust me, the developers, they don't want their system to be down because of that, so they're very careful about those kinds of issues because it's money out of their pocket every second that it's down. So fire, basically a lot of these health and safety issues that you read about on the internet turn all out to be kind of red herring issues. Now when you get into aesthetics, it gets a little bit more of a discussion. Sound is kind of a red herring. I hear people worry about the sound from a solar farm. So they don't really make sound. The solar panels don't make any noise. The thing there's two things that you might hear a little bit of. One is the inverter does hum a little bit. It sounds roughly like a residential outdoor air conditioner unit. So if you're close enough, you might hear that. In most cases, because it's cheaper to put the inverters and the transformers in the middle of these farms because you have shorter wire runs and you're saving wire money, they tend to be sited in the middle. And so by the time you get to the fence line again, you are at ambient, and so you're not hearing any noise from these solar farms. The other thing is you don't have to worry about it at night, because at night there's no sun, and so there's no hum from the inverter, so you really don't have a nighttime noise issue. The other thing that might make a little bit of noise is that we are increasingly starting to see projects with what we call tracking systems. So for many years, systems were what we call fixed tilt. They pointed south, and they pointed south all day long, because as the sun moved across the sky, that was the best way to get the most sunlight. They thought, gee, we could make the panel track the sun, go east to west and track the sun, and that for many, many years turned out to be a bad idea, because all the motors and parts and pieces that had to do all that turned out to be a lot more expensive than the extra solar you were getting out of being able to do that. But the technology has gotten better, and I'm now seeing a lot more of these tracking systems. Again, they're not loud. It is kind of an electrical noise as it very, very slowly tracks the sun throughout the course of the day. It's not a disruptive noise in any way. Barely hear it when you hear it, if you're really listening for it. I don't have exact decibel noise on that. I can get that if somebody wants it. But I would say that the tracking systems, and these are single axis, there are actually parts of the country where they do what they call double axis tracking, where they move all over the place depending on the season as well as the time of day. That's overkill here. Nobody does that yet. But the single axis trackers are more common. There is a tiny amount of noise associated with them, but it's nothing that's going to be disruptive. So this, I don't think, is a big deal, and particularly if you're going to screen with trees around it, you're not going to hear anything from these farms. So sound is not one I would worry about. Glare is another one. We don't have a lot of problems with glare. In order to get glare, you kind of have to be looking right down, as this picture shows, kind of down an angle at the solar panels, and by the time you've done that, you're kind of looking at the sun. So yeah, okay, don't look at the sun. But where it does get to be a little bit of an issue, and where we ran into some problems, was at airports. So not every day, but about a week out of the year, depending on the season, the positioning of the sun, the weather, and a couple other things, we had some reports at some airports around the country where control towers were getting glare off of solar panels that were near the field. Because the solar panels are designed to absorb sunlight, but they do have a glass piece on them, and so if you hit them just right, you can get a little bit of a glare. So Sandia National Labs, which is one of the Department of Energy national labs, worked with the Federal Aviation Administration to develop that really awful acronym, SGHAT, SGAT, software. So basically, any developer that develops a project within a 50-mile radius of an airport now uses this software to model that process and make sure that it is not going to create a glare issue that would impact on the tower. So we basically, it was an issue, we kind of solved that issue. And so we've got that one kind of taken care of. I have seen some model ordinances, or some ordinances where people say, if you're within 50 miles of an airport or within 100 miles of an airport, run this software package to make sure that it's not a problem. I can't remember the exact wording on it, but I could find it for you. But frankly, no solar developer in their right mind would not do that anyway, and so I think it's probably overkill. But if you're looking for that language, I'm sure we can find it.
Is that any airport? Because we do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say it should be any airport. And so trust me, if they're putting it, if you're near the airport, you want to run this software to make sure it's not a problem. It's not a big problem, and you can cite thing in a slightly different way and fix the problem very easily. So it's not a big burden to do it. It's just something that you ought to think of, and it's one of those things that for the first X number of years, we didn't think of it until somebody ran into it as a problem.
Cheryl, our airport doesn't have a tower per se, so it's kind of a non-issue.
Yeah, if there's no tower, then that may also be a non-issue, but that doesn't mean, again, they'll probably run the software anyway, for what it's worth. Now, the don't like the look thing, Yeah, this one's the tough one. You know, down east, you got a lot of flat land, and so screening is a lot easier. And I will say that even there, in the early days of solar development, there were a lot of people that didn't think very carefully about this, and so they didn't specify how high the screening bushes needed to be in order to screen a project. And so the solar panels stand, you know, maybe, you know, the back side of the solar panels maybe yay high off the ground, and they made them put in bushes that were about yay high, and, you know, 10 years later, the bushes are yay high, and so you can still see the solar project. So some of the early projects, there was a little bit of grumpiness about this, and maybe deservedly so. But in that part of the country, you know, it is possible to put in screening plants that can almost completely conceal a solar project if you want to. It's frankly a lot easier to conceal a solar project than it is, for example, a hog farm. Just saying. My hog farm friends, we do a lot of work in bioenergy, so they smack me when I say that. But, you know, it's okay. We like them too. But the problem you guys have is this. It's called hills. So, you know, there is a limit to what you're going to be able to do with screening in this part of the country. And as you move further west, the problem obviously gets to be potentially bigger and bigger. No pun intended. So, all I can say is this is one that falls on y'all. You know, the local community is going to have to figure out what makes the most sense for them. There are some neighbors that may want to see screening because they live directly next door and it might help them. There may be some neighbors that live across 5 acres away and can see it on the hill. And, you know, if it was somebody building a Walmart, they'd have to look at that too. So I think that, you know, is one of those conversations that you guys probably have about a lot of different topics. The one thing I would suggest, and I will suggest this on many, many topics today, is don't treat this any different than any other kind of development. For whatever reason, people try to make solar into something different than other types of development and make it more complicated than other types of development. And it's really not. In a lot of ways, it's simpler than most other development. It's a lot safer than most other development. And it's one of the few kinds of development that if you really wanted to, 30 years from now when that project's done, you could go in and pull all the posts out of the ground and recycle all those materials and go back to having a big grassy hill there if you wanted. Try to do that with a Walmart. You know, so, you know, it's very different than a lot of other different types of development. And so, for whatever reason, people want to penalize it almost and by putting extra restrictions on it, when in a lot of ways, it probably deserves fewer restrictions. And I say that as a solar guy, I get that, but for what it's worth. Yes, sir.
We had a lot of discussion about reclaiming the land when it's over.
Mm-hmm.
Is that an issue?
It is an issue, but it's a very manageable issue, and I'll talk about it in just a couple minutes. I'll try to talk faster to make sure I get the time to talk about it, if that's okay. So we talked a little bit about property taxes and the other local impacts. We've talked about, you know, switching from farmland to this is a big deal for a lot of local communities. Solar has larger total cash flows, but it's going to hit the economy very differently. Probably one of the biggest issues down east, and it's probably less of an issue here, but you have a lot of contract farmers down east. People that have been leasing land to farm it for years, maybe in some cases generations, and they've been paying $100 an acre to grow soybeans on it, and somebody shows up and wants to pay $350 an acre to put solar panels on it, and families that have been farming the same piece of land for 30 years suddenly find themselves without land to farm. That is a conversation that a local community really has to sort out, because that $350 an acre turns into property taxes that may buy school buses for the first time in that county in 20 years too, but they got to manage that conversation. I think up here you probably got less of that because you're going to have a whole other set of issues about land use because you've just got a lot more competition for the land. But it's something to be aware of, is that this is going to hit your community in a way that is different than whatever you're currently doing is hitting your community. And so you just kind of need to think about that from a tax standpoint.
Is that $350 an acre, is that a month or a year? Is that an annual income?
That's an annual per acre number. Or is it, that's not
It's
monthly.
annual.
It's annual, yeah. I was getting excited for a second there. No.
No.
And that is a totally random number. I have heard numbers as low as $150, and I have heard numbers as high, although I don't believe them, of $1,200 an acre. It would depend a lot on where it is. You know, if there is a substation and a transmission line running right next to the property, and you've got, you know, 500 acres under control, that land's a lot more likely to get leased at a higher price than 50 acres in the middle of downtown with a park next to it. So that's the kinds of conversations that go on. So we talked a little bit about this. Co-op Extension at NC State has some really good fact sheets that they've done that talk about the tax implications. I don't know if any of you guys know Guido Vanderhoeven. Guido is NC State's, I know it's a great name, he's Dutch. But Guido, he's got some great work that he's done, and he's the tax expert in co-op extension with the rural community. So he's done some things that look at this. You can look at this in more detail when you look at the presentation later in the interest of time. But I've done some work recently with NCSEA, just looking at some specific counties to try and gauge what we think the impact is of adding solar in. And you can see these two tables here. So annual taxes paid for real property on parcels with solar farm. What we did was we looked at it 1 year before solar was installed and then 1 year after solar was installed. And we looked at the numbers, and you can see that before solar in Catawba, for example, $49,000 was collected on the property tax of that property. 1 year after, it went up to $101,000. That's that coming out of the PUV program and the increase in the value there. What's a little more eye-popping is the number below that, which is the annual personal property tax on the equipment. Same county, before the solar, there was nothing to pay personal property tax on. After they built the farm, $397,000. So I will say this is 5 counties that we pulled out randomly because they had the easy, well, I shouldn't say randomly, they had the easiestly available tax data on their websites. So I'm not going to say this is representative data, and please consider this to be draft. This is not published. But it's to give you at least a general sense as to what we're looking at in the counties where they've been running these numbers. I'm hoping later this year or early in the wintertime to have a study where we look at least 20 counties and have some really good data on this. So keep in touch if you'd like to get more detail on this. Yes, sir.
Is that money going only to the county, or is it coming to the municipality?
That's mostly a county, but I mean, that would depend on what the municipality does, what its deal is with the county A, and then whether it charges its own taxes. This is county money.
It would affect the towns, very much so, yeah.
I mean, there would certainly be a washing, or what do they call that, a multiplier effect that would affect the towns. But, because if you've got more money in your pocket, you're going to spend it in town. But that said, that's a conversation to have with your local county commissioners. Have fun with that one too. I'm just here to tell you what's out there. So that's out there. Another question that comes up a lot is neighboring property values. There's not a lot of great data on this, but basically people are concerned that if I build a solar farm, that the house next door's property value will go down. Now I can tell you there's a lot of data on this on wind farms, and the answer is no, it's not true. I can tell you there's a lot of data on residential solar from around the country that basically says, no, that's not true. In fact, it actually increases the value of the neighboring property to residential solar. If you put solar on your house, your next door neighbor's house goes up in value. But for a solar farm to be put into the middle of, a neighborhood, we don't have a lot of data, and most of that is because, as you remember, the solar farms have happened fairly recently, and the other thing that was going on during a lot of that time frame was the Great Depression, or Great Recession. So we didn't have a lot of turnover of homes. Plus, a lot of those homes are family homes in eastern North Carolina that have been in the same family for a long, long, long time. So there's not a lot of turnover. So we just don't have a lot of data points yet. One study that was done by a guy who gets cited, I think, at every single county commission meeting in the state at this point. But it was a legitimate study he did in Goldsboro. I'm trying to remember his name off the top of my head. Do you remember his name? You don't remember his name?
No, I have a question related to that.
Let me finish this thought and then I'll come to you. So there's a guy out there who does this work. He's an appraiser. And he looked at a development in Goldsboro where they had built half the development and then the solar farm went in and then they built the other half of the development. And he found no difference. Now the issue is there are some people that are not going to buy a house if solar farm goes in. There's no question of that. But there's someone else that will. And so as long as someone's going to buy it at the price, there's no impact on the property tax value, or on the property value. If you got to a point where you felt like you couldn't find buyers for the home, that would be a measurable outcome that would be a negative. No one has shown me any data to date that shows that that's a problem. Now I will tell you, that's going to be very locally driven. Goldsboro, it's relatively low density, it's not rural, but it's not real urban. There was a discussion, we're in Union County, right?
Yes, sir.
I can remember there was a discussion about putting some solar farm over by the lake, and that, what's the lake down there?
Lake Providence?
I'm sorry?
Lake Providence?
Nope.
Cane Creek?
The big lake that everybody vacations on.
Lake Norman?
Lake Norman, thank you.
Well, Norman's,
A little further, I'm sorry, I'm pointing the wrong direction, that's what threw everybody
North.
off.
Ardell County.
There was a discussion about putting a project near Lake Norman, and I believe the pitchforks and torches came out, and nobody was very happy about the potential impact of the property taxes there. On the other side of the county, another project went in, and, it was apparently a not quite as high a rent area, and nobody seemed to mind very much. Those kinds of discussions happen all the time, and I would completely say that there is a legitimacy to that conversation, just in terms of property value impact. You want to get into an environmental justice conversation, you'll have to buy me several shots, but we can have that discussion too. But that is a conversation that's out there that you need to be aware of. But to date, there is no real evidence one way or the other that I would point to that I would say is tremendously credible on the impact of neighboring property values, for what it's worth, other than this one study which showed nothing.
Question.
Yes, sir, I'm sorry.
Is it fair to say that most solar farms are typically going on farmland?
I would say that to date, the vast majority of projects have gone on farmland, and so the density of homes near that farmland is very low. It's not universally true, though. We've seen them go in industrial zoned areas, and we've seen some projects that have gone in areas with more residential housing. I've seen some that have gone in places where I would not have chosen to do. This is another subject for perhaps revisions to our model ordinance. I don't want to point fingers at any particular developer, but there was one developer that cited a project, had worked it out with a landowner. The landowner happened to have land that was bordering against a private school. Well, that landowner, the private school kids had been playing in that landowner's field for 30 years, and he hated it. And so he was more than happy that the setback for the school was only 15 feet. That was not a good situation for anybody. And so I might suggest that if you're looking at setbacks, that, setbacks around schools might need to be a little bit more than they are around some other types of commercial use. Just something to think about.
The only reason I asked the question was because if I'm living in a house and next door to me is a farm, and that farm can either have a field of cows, a field of corn, or a field of solar panels, to me, that doesn't affect my property values.
It shouldn't, but to some people who have been sitting on that same porch for 70 years, and they come out every morning and they like to look at the cows or the corn because of the bucolicness of it, it would have an impact. Some people like to come out on the porch and look at money, whether it's soybeans or corn or cows or solar panels, and those people probably care less. And some people come out and want to sit on the porch and worry that their grandkids are not going to have oceanfront property in Goldsboro, and so they're more than happy to look at solar panels. So, everybody's got their own different take on these things. It's not my job to make that call. Unfortunately, y'all are the ones that get to make that call, and then your elected officials further up the chain, and they can have a lot of fun with that. So that's what I can tell you about that. So, some other common land use, and now we're going to get into your returning it to original use discussion. Agricultural land trade-offs. The first question that we used to get was, are we using up all of the land in the state with solar panels? And I'm really trying to talk fast. I know I'm going long, I apologize. There were a lot of people that were very concerned that all of a sudden all of the land in the state was starting to turn into solar panels. If you were driving around down east, you couldn't turn around without bumping into a solar project for a while. And so people were worried about that. But we did a little GIS work. Actually, I should say that Mike's group did a little GIS work. And we found all of the projects in the state, and we mapped them out. And what we found was that with about 3.5 gigawatts of solar on the ground, we had used 0.2% of North Carolina's 4.75 million acres of total cropland. Now, if you look at just the prime cropland, it's a little bit bigger percentage, but it was still well under 1%. There's a lot of stuff that's in this slide here, but the big thing is if you use solar farms to meet the whole 12.5% of the North Carolina portfolio standard, it would require about 1% of North Carolina's cropland. So we've got plenty of cropland. When you look at the percentages that are going on to cropland versus other types of land versus forest land, that's not an issue that we're worried about. However, there's a lot of things that you do need to worry about when you're citing these projects. And you guys are the planning board, so I don't need to even waste time on this slide, but identifying and defining the solar resources, acknowledging that the solar development has benefits and desired co-benefits, identifying the solar development opportunities and the conflicts in the community, which are frequently there, and then setting the targeting and development goals. That's what a solar development plan should do, just like any other kind of development plan, right? There's nothing there that's different than any other kind of development conversation that you're going to have. And there are potential conflicts: agricultural practices, forest resources, historic resources, redevelopment of other types of competing resources. We mentioned the airports discussion and other infrastructure, natural areas. If it's fenced around, you can't go there and hang out anymore, right? There's agricultural protection measures that can prevent a lot of things that come out of this. There are some that are less good ideas. The state's Natural Wildlife Commission was at one point advocating that you raise these fences 6 inches off the ground so that turtles and small animals can get in and out of the fence line and not get trapped. And I was like, yeah, that means that my kid could crawl under there too, I bet. So we had to put the nix on that idea. Not every idea is a good idea, but there are ways of dealing with a lot of these kinds of issues. But it's important to remember that while those issues are out there in ag land, it doesn't mean that we're turning ag land into an industrial site. Solar is not an industrial land use. That is an old coal station there next to it.
It's like the Buck one that just imploded.
It might be, actually, now that you say that.
Yeah, they imploded it on Friday.
But what you've got is, you don't have, fuel delivery via rail or road or pipeline. You don't have massive amounts of water being brought in for cooling, for other types of uses or cleaning. These are, you don't have major sewer and water and road access needs. They're not industrial sites. They're not residential sites. There's something in between there. And so it's important to realize that, again, we want to appropriately regulate, but we don't want to penalize them unnecessarily.
Question.
Yeah.
You talked about access. You spoke about earlier, just a minute ago, about how close you are to a line. If I want to put a solar panel or a solar farm here, and the closest place to get the power onto the grid is over here, there's a property in between that's not mine, how much can I say we're putting a line through your property?
Well, if you're a developer, you can't. You can go and negotiate with that property owner. I suppose you could go and negotiate with the town or the county and have a conversation about an easement, but that pretty much is going to fall on that property owner, and that property owner, if I had to guess, is going to make out like a bandit. It's just kind of the way it works, right? This is not the utility company using eminent domain to do this usually.
That was my clarification, and you just answered that.
Now, it's an interesting question. I've never asked the question if Duke Energy is building a solar farm, if they could use eminent domain to do that. I bet they probably could. But I've never asked that question, and I will just pretend I didn't ask it right now either. You don't have to worry about that.
Put it on the list.
Put it on the list. Another type of project that we've started to see some conversations about are brownfield sites. I don't know if y'all have any of these in this neck of the woods, but old landfills for small community solar style projects. We're starting to have a lot of conversations in Western Virginia and West Virginia about taking mountaintop removal sites and turning them into solar projects, because it's a good use of kind of returning the land to something useful. This may not be a big deal here because you may not have a lot within the town area, but in the county there may be some landfills that are getting closed eventually that might be sites to think about, so I won't dwell on that. But when you get to ag impacts of these projects, these are the big things that you think about. First of all, topsoil. Down east, there's not a lot of grading that goes with solar projects. It's already dead flat. And so it's really not been an issue from an erosion standpoint. As you move this direction, there may be more interest in grading a site in order to make it more friendly for that development. And that is the sort of thing that I would assume you guys deal with on lots of different types of development. And I would say you would treat that the way you would treat any other development project, right? I wouldn't treat it differently, but I would treat it appropriately.
Yeah, you usually have to have soil erosion control.
I will talk about pervious surfaces in just a minute, but we'll come back to that. The next thing is compaction. There's the potential for soil compaction depending on how they do this. No developer is gonna come in and lay, asphalt in the middle of these things. Why would they do that? It would cost them extra money for no good reason. They may put in gravel roads if it's not a particularly wet area, they may not even bother doing that. But you will have soil compaction. So when you reclaim a site, you're gonna have to deal with that. It's easy enough to deal with soil compaction, but you do have to deal with it. The two big problems from a chemical standpoint or a soil standpoint that we've run into are actually from the galvanized steel posts. So it's not the solar panels, but it's the galvanized steel, just like any other galvanized steel. It's designed to leach that zinc into the soil in order to avoid rusting, right? Well, it turns out zinc's not a big deal. There's no crop that we grow in North Carolina or anywhere else that I've found that gives much of a crap about zinc. But aluminum. There's plenty of aluminum in the soil and nothing really cares about the aluminum. Zinc, peanuts don't like zinc. And so, I don't think y'all are Peanut County, are you? This is probably not a big deal here, but in certain counties where they grow peanuts, this is a question. I had very lengthy conversations with the folks in the College of Ag and Life Sciences about this, and we did not come to a conclusion as to how big a problem it is. Nobody could tell me whether the whole field would never grow peanuts again, or there'd be places where the posts were that wouldn't grow peanuts again, or if it was actually such a small amount of zinc that it probably wouldn't have any impact anyway. So we said, flag it and let people know that it might be an issue. So that's the one thing that we know of from a development standpoint that you'd want to worry about if you were going to return to crop growing. Sounds like it's not much of an issue here. The other thing is, of course, if you take it out of agricultural production for 25, 30 years, your pH and your nutrients in the soil are going to be a little out of whack, and so you're going to have to do fertilizer and get the pH levels back to where it is. Again, things that are manageable to do as long as you haven't lost all of your topsoil over the preceding 25 years, and so you want to manage that process, which is worth talking about. Lot coverage. So sometimes I see zoning codes and they try to deal with this issue by just basically saying we're going to limit the amount of the property that can be used for this kind of development for solar. That's kind of using a sledgehammer to drive in a thumbtack. If you're worried about setbacks and proximity to things, then use setbacks. And if you're worried about the erosion issues, there are better ways of dealing with the erosion issues than putting a limit on the total amount of property in an area that can be used. That to me smacks of telling somebody how they use their property, which is a little bit more problematic potentially. Different counties do it in different ways. I've seen it done that way. It's not what I would suggest would be an easy or best practice because it creates a lot of questions. But when you look at the surface of a PV project, you can see that it's not really what we would call an impervious surface. It's not like a parking lot, and it shouldn't get treated like one from a zoning standpoint. There's space between the modules themselves, and then there's rows between the modules, and all of these sites have engineering work done to manage the water flow. That's part of the process of the development. So as long as you're dealing with this in with the developer in a way that's appropriate to the project, I would deal with it using setbacks and erosion control discussions rather than trying to put limits on the total amount of solar on a piece of property that can go in. Because that basically the more absolute those kinds of requirements get, the more likely you are to just lose the development altogether. People say it's just easier to go somewhere else. Yeah.
We currently have a requirement that the water runoff from the property after it's developed has to be the same or less than what it was pre-development. Retention ponds, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Would that also apply?
Well, all right, remembering that I'm the policy guy, and I will add that to my list to confirm, but my suspicion would be yes. I don't know why it wouldn't. Okay. Now, the other thing that's kind of fun, and we've seen a lot of this actually on y'all's neck of the woods, are some of the agricultural synergies that come out of this. The thing that started it was we had one company down here in the Charlotte area called O2 Energies, and they got this idea that rather than mowing the grass 6 times a year at these sites to keep from shading their panels, they would work with some local sheep folks, and they bring sheep in, and they kind of restrict them to a certain area within the farm, and the sheep basically mow the grass for them. And so they've got this deal where they've got solar sheep, and I guess you can buy solar sheep meat and solar sheep milk and all these other crazy solar sheep things you can do. And so it's an interesting little thing. I just had a whole bunch of researchers at NC State come to me the other day, and they want to meet with developers of solar projects because they think this is the coolest idea since sliced bread, and they want to try and expand it. I warned them that as the projects get to be 6,000 acres and half a gigawatt, that may be a lot of sheep, but we're working through that, and there may be some interesting opportunities for that kind of agricultural benefit. The other thing that's come up for a synergy with agriculture is pollinator-friendly vegetation. We're already trying to make sure that these developers are not using non-native plants. In fact, the wildlife guys down at the state, whose acronym I can never come up with. No, it's not DENR, it's the North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission. There we go. Those guys are pushing hard on the native plants thing, and they've recently gotten involved in this discussion about pollinator-friendly vegetation. We've got some issues to work out with it because you want certain seeds, and most of those are seeds that we weren't using a lot of, and so nobody can get the seeds yet. So over time, we think we will be able to get to a point where the market will support enough of these seeds that we'll be able to do these projects. So what I would warn you is, if you want to put something in an ordinance to encourage this kind of thing, either build it in so that there is some time for it to catch up, or don't make it so rigid that nobody can build a project until they have enough seeds to build a project, which is what happened to a project in Virginia. They actually basically said there will be no projects in the state unless you take all of the land in the fenced-in area and convert it into pollinator-friendly habitat. And they were like, you mean I have to dig up all the grass that was already there that I wasn't even going to touch? And they were like, yes. And they were like, we can't find the seeds, and it was crazy. So don't go overkill on it, but there is definitely opportunity here to encourage pollinator-friendly habitats that help us with the bees, which means we're helping with the farming side. You can see these jars of honey down there. This is actually, the group that started this is a group out of Minnesota called Fresh Energy. And they sell solar honey, among other things. And they have this neat, it's called it's like a checklist, basically. So they say a solar certified, apiary friendly solar farm. South Carolina actually wrote something like this checklist into legislation last summer. And so South Carolina is pushing this pretty aggressively. I think in North Carolina, we're seeing a lot of interest in it. All of the developers are very excited about it. But everybody just wants to make sure that we do it in a way that doesn't block anything from happening in the short run while we figure it out. So it's an interesting wrinkle. I'd keep it in mind. Yes, sir.
So there's nothing special about the bees or the sheep or whatever it is. It's just that supporting the bees or the sheep or the llamas or whatever, supporting them is supporting the community that is involved with the solar project and activity.
Exactly. In fact, I mean, so the biggest issue is the sheep guys can't go inside the fence line unless they've been trained, right? Because of the National Electric Code requirements. So there's only a limited number of those folks that have been through that training. And so I think there's like 2 companies that are just, printing money right now because they're the only guys that are certified to go in and do this. But everybody's catching on. And so in fact, I think we're going to create a training class for sheep farmers to teach them how to do this.
You don't have to train sheep, do you?
I'm sorry?
You don't have to train sheep.
I don't. It's funny, because first the conversation was, we kept saying goats by mistake. Goats and solar panels, bad combination. They eat the wires, they climb up on top of the panels. It was a mess. Then we had a discussion about, well, could we do cows? Well, we talked to some folks in New York. The cows like to go up to the solar panels and start rubbing on them, knocking them over. Horses do. So then somebody said chickens. I was like, are you kidding me? I am not cleaning all that off the solar panels. So I think we're settled on sheep right now. But the sheep are good, and the bees. The bees you can put the hives outside of the fence and the clover inside the fence, and so that's a little easier. But these are the kinds of things that all the ag guys at NC State are thinking about: is how can we take this solar, which helps to stabilize the farming community by, like I said, it's their 401k plan, right? And then gives them something to do in the ag sector as well. And so I think in the next year or two, if you go up to the state fair, you're going to start seeing, solar honey jars and things like that as part of the marketing up there. It's coming, and the solar developers are all about it. Some of them because they really believe it. Some of them because they think it's probably a good way to make people like them. To be honest, greenwashing is greenwashing, but if it turns into real honey and it turns into more bees and it turns into more sheep products for the state, I'm all in favor of it, and so I think it's a good thing.
The company that works with O2 that Steve mentioned is called Sun Raised Farms. And it's just a perfect partnership because not only are the sheep grazing the land and keeping the grass down, but then the meat, Sun Raised Farms sells the meat to Whole Foods, who previously was getting their lamb from New Zealand. So you think about shipping that all the way over here. So the sustainability cycle is just over and over with that model. So.
I didn't know they were selling to Whole Foods. That's
Yeah.
pretty cool.
Mm-hmm.
And so even better. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about recycling. So we talked about this briefly earlier, but if you look at solar panels, you know, you've got glass, aluminum, plastics, some metals, and some semiconductors. It's roughly the same stuff that's in that old clunker car up there that's getting ready to get recycled. There's a lot of the same materials in it. It is not hard to recycle solar panels. They're doing it in Europe now because Europe's further ahead of us in the life cycle of solar. Average solar panel has a warranty on it these days of 25 to 30 years. The thing that's going to cause solar panels to get replaced first in most cases is that they're going to get so much more efficient that they're going to start pulling solar panels off and replacing them with new panels just to make more money because they can make more electricity per square foot. But those panels that get pulled off aren't going to get thrown away. They're going to get stuck and shipped off to Africa or someplace where somebody can use them, or a school here or something. Solar panels have a very long lifespan. They have a very long warranty, and then that warranty says that they're going to work at 90% of their original output in year 25. So you can imagine they're going to be at it a long time. Again, they made them so we didn't have to run extension cords to satellites. They're pretty durable. So, but when we get a bunch of them, we will be able to recycle them. My expectation is, much like in Europe, basically there are companies that do recycling. When the market emerges, they will get into the business of doing this. It's, you know, kind of supply and demand market forces. We have 3 or 4 companies that I've talked to in North Carolina that will recycle solar panels today, but they don't do a lot of it because there's not a lot of solar panels to recycle yet. But when they have breakages on site and they're not from that company, First Solar, that makes you send them back to them, there is a place to send them today. One of those companies is down here in the Charlotte area. I should remember its name, but I can't off the top of my head. But there are a few already out there, and there will be more as this emerges. So recycling is not going to be a problem, but as I noted, you can landfill them if you had to. If a tornado ripped through a giant solar farm tomorrow, well, it doesn't really matter what it is. If a tornado rips through it, you're going to be landfilling a bunch of something. And so you can do that, yeah.
Do you guys know of anybody that's decommissioned the site yet?
There's been one site where there was a problem with the modules were manufactured and there was a flaw in the modules. And so they were dramatically underproducing and they did decommission the site. There were no problems with that decommissioning. I don't know a lot about it, but I just heard about this for the first time about 2 weeks ago. It happened several years ago and it was pretty quiet, which makes me wonder why it was pretty quiet. But I've not heard anything from any local government official that was affiliated with it that there was a problem.
'Cause that's what I'm worried. I mean, I'm worried about, but we don't have any history of. I mean, that clunker you have, that's recyclable as well.
Right.
You know, but the chain link fence they're not going to put around it. You know, to put around it, that may or may not be.
Well, and
That's kind of, you know, I'm worried about.
this is what brings you to really the biggest thing you guys have to sort out, which is this decommissioning conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of range of options on this. And so I just went to this slide. This is actually from the model ordinance, but I will tell you that the first thing that I'm going to insist we revise in the model ordinance is the decommissioning slide, because we were way too simplistic because we didn't know any better yet. The long and short is the stuff's recyclable. It's got a huge lifespan. What's going to happen to most of these sites, the most valuable thing about these sites after you get past the first 7 or 8 years of energy production is that interconnection. Because you've paid a lot of money in engineering studies and things to Duke Energy to have permission to connect to that grid. I'll bet you money most of those sites, unless we invent dilithium crystals or flux capacitors or something like that between now and 30 years from now, most of those sites are going to get repowered with more solar panels. Not to say we won't have dilithium crystals or flux capacitors. It would be awesome, but you know. So the more likely thing is they're going to they're gonna get repurposed with more solar panels. But if you want to decommission, we talked about the ag issues. You can certainly go right back to the kind of land that you had there in the first place if you want to. All this material, the steel and the copper wires and all that stuff, it's for the most part all recyclable. So the first concern I got was, well, a lot of these projects are put together as LLCs, and those LLCs, the ownerships change. Because in the early days, there was a lot of tax credit deals. Those tax credit deals, as the tax credits were used up, partners started dropping out. Because a lot of the owners of those LLCs were people like Blue Cross Blue Shield, right? You know, people that had big tax liabilities. And as the tax credits went away, they weren't interested in being part of the company anymore, and so they left. And so the ownership of the projects has changed. And so some town managers driving past the site and the grass is tall, and they call up the guy that was the owner of the project to come and mow the grass because it's supposed to do that. And they say, we don't own that anymore. And it might have changed hands twice since then, right? So what we started saying was, all right, there needs to be a decommissioning plan. There needs to be some kind of plan that says this is how we're going to decommission this project. Everybody said, well, that's great, but if it changes hands 5 times, what good does that do? All right, well, let's do this. Let's make the decommissioning plan something that you have to file with the Register of Deeds, and you have to revise it every 5 years. Yeah, well, you could go shorter. Please don't. 5 is plenty. Maybe give them 7 years, because the first 7 years is the tax credit period, the federal tax credit. After that, they've used up the federal tax credit, then it'll change hands. But once they've done up the federal tax credit, at that point, you want to start tracking it, right? So when you get to a certain point, have them file every 5 years at the Registry of Deeds. Okay, well, that's great, but what if the company goes bankrupt? Well, that's kind of a problem. Well, all right, well, let's say that part of the decommissioning plan is you have to value all the materials on site so that you know what the recycled value of those materials are. Because what do we say it was? It's steel, it's copper, it's glass, it's all these things that are commodity value out there in the marketplace. And so in most cases, when we run the numbers today, the commodity value of recycling vastly outweighs the cost of removing the stuff from the property. And so you'd be an idiot not to take the site and decommission it and take it all to the recycling center and make a bunch of money. But somebody said, well, 10 years from now, we might have invented the copper wire equivalent of dilithium crystals, and suddenly copper wire isn't worth anything. Okay, fine. Then the next step down the path is do your decommissioning plan, do it every 5 years, put those numbers in it every 5 years, figure out what the value of the material is at that point, figure out what the value of the removal or the cost of the removal is at that point, see what the delta is. Require a bond on that, or that plus 10% or something. Because if you do what some counties did, there were some counties out there that were like, we want a decommissioning bond for the whole shooting match for 30 years up front. And the guy said, bye, we'll see you later. No tax revenue for your county or your town or your families or whoever it might be. You can do that, and again, that is y'all's decision. And in the end, that's the community's decision. But there's this whole range of options that you can walk down depending on how far you want to go in trying to assure you're protected. Every step down that path makes it less likely that developers are going to come here. But it makes it more certain that when they do, you're not going to have a problem 25 years from now when your kids are sitting on this board. And so that's the equation you guys have to balance in the process. I can tell you that I've seen plenty of communities that have gone way down this path one direction and have regretted it because they lost all that opportunity. I have not seen anybody regret it on this end yet, but that's because none of the panels are old enough for us to know yet. So what I would suggest is think about those kinds of steps. And the ones I just threw out at you are the ones that I throw out as examples. You would want to have the lawyers sit down and figure out what that looks like. You would probably want to talk with the developers and see what they think makes sense. And I will tell you that they will tell you that's way more complicated than they want to deal with, but they'll deal with it. Find something that makes everybody comfortable, that gives you a certain amount of comfort that you're not going to get stuck with. Because where this problem comes from was trailer parks, right? everybody used to worry because you'd have a trailer park get abandoned, somebody would go out there and strip all the aluminum siding off the trailers and leave a bunch of skeletons with the insulation blowing in the wind. You know, it looked like hell and nobody wanted to move in there. You know, that's the kind of mindset that you guys have to have because you've seen it before and it's the only thing you got to compare this to. Well, the reality is there's a lot of materials here that have a lot of positive value, and if you want to deal with decommissioning in a way that makes logical sense, you can probably do it in a way that will attract economic development and create a lot of opportunity for your community.
I'd have to say, just staying on topic, you look at wind farms, right, that have been around for a while, and you look at those decommissioned, broken wind farms out west that are just sitting there not being used, and a lot of parts that are not being.
Well, so there's a little bit of a mythology around that. There are a few wind farms where that's the case, and they are some of the early ones where the towers were so short that it didn't make sense to repower them. And they also had some real problems with the very first wind farms that they did out there. They didn't know a lot about birds and bats and how that interacted with wind farms, and so there's horrible videos out there of, like, you know, they located some of the original wind farms right in like the endangered condor species migratory path. You know, stuff that, you know, you learn from mistakes. That was a big one. But that said, for the most part, you don't see a lot of wind turbines of scale that are not operating for long because it's money out of the developer's pocket if it's not operating. They have an economic incentive to make sure these things are working and working right. And so those kinds of problems usually take care of themselves. The problem for you guys is if it changes hands multiple times, you're not exactly sure who you're dealing with. And so if there is a problem, you want to know who to call. And that's why I like the, you know, every 5 years file at the Register of Deeds and make sure that somebody knows who owns the project and who's in charge of mowing the grass. But, you know, again, there's lots and lots of different ways to handle that, and every community should figure out the best way for them.
Well, if they change hands, originally like, for example, they have a contract, 20 to 25 years is what I'm hearing, that they will give the landowner, you know,
Usually.
to make it profitable.
Well, the panels have a lifespan of 20 to 25
Right.
years, and so that's usually what they're aiming for is they expect to replace the inverters once in the middle of that. They build that into the project finances, but they expect that project to operate for at least 25 years at 90% of its original capacity.
So my question is, even if it changes hands multiple times, you've still got that contract. It seems like they would be required to, you know.
Well, but that's different, right? The landowner may still be getting his lease payment from whoever that is, but that doesn't mean that the landowner is necessarily responsible for mowing the grass inside the fence. In fact, I can guarantee you he's not, because he's probably not allowed inside the fence.
Right, but you're talking about a decommissioning plan, every 5 years to file a decommissioning plan, but I mean, if they're not decommissioning.
So the person who files that plan is the owner of the system, and he's filing it for in the event that eventually we're going to decommission this. And because the commodities markets change over time, because technology changes over time, you want them to update it periodically just to make sure that it stays close to reality. But there's relatively little chance that that plan is ever going to get enacted. Frankly, there's relatively little chance that it's ever going to get enacted even at 30 years, because like I said, they're probably going to come in, pull all those solar panels off and put brand new solar panels on.
So wouldn't every 10 years be more realistic?
Every 10 years would be fine with me. It's really what y'all are comfortable with.
Okay.
But the key is to connect it to the grid once you have the site up and running.
Well, that's the biggest value of the project, is that interconnection to the grid, because that's hard to get. The sites where you can do it are limited. You know, that's why we won't have solar panels covering 90% of the land in the state of North Carolina, is because there's a limited number of places to put solar panels, because there's a limited number of wires out there that are big enough and robust enough to handle that being added to the grid. So it's a naturally limiting phenomenon, and that means that the sites where you can do it have value. And so those are the sites that are going to have value, and those are the places where, you know, in all likelihood, something's going to be there from a power standpoint. You don't usually, and I mean, I get this question a lot. This is not meant to be crass, but nobody asks me what the decommissioning bond on building a Walmart with a giant parking lot is. You know, for some reason, for solar, we have this different conversation. Now, if I was building a half a gigawatt, 6,000 acre solar farm, I would damn well want to have this conversation. But, you know, when I'm talking about a 35 acre solar farm, you know, is it really that different than building a Walmart, especially when you know that you can basically take it right back down to, you know, to agricultural land when you're done?
If it was a 35 acre Walmart,
I mean,
yeah, it would. I mean, you know, we would have the same conversation, I think it was a 35 acre automotive, you know,
Sure.
junkyard.
Sure, but it shouldn't be different than that conversation, is what I'm saying.
Right.
You know, it should be appropriate to what you're doing. And a lot of people want to treat these kinds of things, for some reason, solar gets like the biggest, hardest, most and the solar guys bring it on themselves, I think, because they're always out there, and they want to make sure that they're not offending anybody. It comes from this long history of wearing tie-dyes and Birkenstocks, I think. But, you know, they're always out there trying to do, you know, the right thing was where it all kind of started. Now there's all these business guys in the solar industry, and I can, you know, so I told you, I remember when it was tie-dyes and camo and, you know, the pot growers in Northern California and the militias in Southern Idaho. The guys that are in there now, you know, they all got skinny ties, they're all from Europe, they're all work for banks. It's a different conversation than when I started.
Well, and I think some of the problem too, to be honest with you, is that, you know, when utility scale development started in North Carolina, we had a lot of companies that came here from other parts of the country and just built these solar farms because they could do it by right. And they would plop it down, put a chain link fence around it and call it a day, right? And so we now understand the importance of community engagement.
That's absolutely true.
And there are really good developers out there that get that. And one other thing, by the way, on page 20 of the template ordinance, there is an example decommissioning plan that you can start with.
And that's a pretty simplified decommissioning plan, I will say. It doesn't have a lot of the things we just talked about, but it is a good starting point for the conversation.
It concerns me a little bit, it's not been validated, right? Because no one's decommissioned before. And that's, you got a plan, but if you have no historical implementation of that, how well does it work?
Good point.
Well, but, you know, again, I mean, there's a lot of things you can say that about, and we require a lot less from a decommissioning standpoint too. You know, I mean, don't treat this differently. Is all, that's all I can say. It's just, when you're doing it, it's not any different than other types of development, other than in some ways it's easier to deal with than other types of development. Sometimes it's bigger, but that's probably its biggest Achilles heel, is that these projects are getting bigger and bigger. But from a remove it down and go back to what you want, a decommissioning standpoint, it's a lot easier to do that with something like this than it is with a strip mall.
Yeah, but I think you hit on the nail that this is unique. It's not the Walmart, it's not the soybean field. It's unique, it's somewhere in the middle. And it's kind of hard, I think, to look at that the same as anything else, because there is nothing else like this. And I can
That's
think of other than maybe it's a junkyard or,
So maybe you've got brackets, right?
yeah.
Maybe you've got the soybean farm and you've got the strip mall, and you're looking for something between those that makes sense. And, you know, I'm just one guy, and I work for the university. I would certainly have conversations with people that do this for a living. But, you know, what I'm saying is try and find something appropriate that's not so restricted that no one wants to talk to you anymore, and at the same time leaves you, you know, without a huge potential risk.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, you had a question as well?
Yeah, I did. And going back to the decommissioning of this and saying that people are going to want to be getting into this and they're going to want to continue it, and maybe it might become a sort of like a legacy kind of thing. But my question is, if it becomes so popular, and you know, obviously it's a large cash generator, would that affect? I mean, because it's supply and demand. So would that affect the price? So would it in fact become one of those things where there's so many people in it, it would become like a glut, and so the payout would be less because of the fact that there's more people in it, and so then people are going to start, because that's what the rate is, so people are going to start moving away from it, and then decommissioning might become more.
Well, and again, which is why I would suggest that you have that timeliness updating. But remember, the copper market is a lot bigger than the solar market. The glass market is a lot bigger, the steel market, the aluminum market. You know, solar is big, but it's not that big. And so those are legitimate questions which is again why I would suggest, because again, you know, we might come up with some new conductor and suddenly copper wire is not terribly useful anymore. I can't think of what that would be, but my engineering friends might. You know, if that happens, you know, who knows? And so having that updating process in there to let you make sure that you're dealing with that. And if you get to a point where all of a sudden the cost of removal is greater than the value of the commodities, then you take that delta and that would be something reasonable to ask for a bond on. But asking for a bond to remove the whole thing on day one for 30 years, you know, A, you'll never find anybody to give you that bond, and B, it would completely price the project, then we'll just go elsewhere. It just makes no sense.
Is there a minimum amount of acreage that make it cost effective to have a solar farm? Do you know that?
Well, it used to be right around 5.
Have the 100 probably.
Now it's, they like them bigger
Right.
because the economies of scale is the primary driver. There's a lot of talk, you know, so we've talked about a little bit about rooftop. Rooftop is more expensive. You know, you asked how cheap solar was, you know, in the utility scale. Well, it's about 5 times that price to put it on a house than it is to put it out in the field, maybe more. Because the scale matters that much. Plus, you got to have guys climbing on roofs with ladders, and you got to have different types of insurance and all this. The residential or the rooftop market is almost like a totally different industry in a lot of ways. It uses the same equipment, but it's almost a totally different conversation in a lot of ways. I really wish they had kept the state tax credit for rooftop solar to help get that market going so that we could get those economic benefits from those jobs that be created. I'm not a legislator, nobody cares what I think. But those are different pieces of the puzzle. As far as what size it has to be, I don't know that there's an answer, but I can tell you that I never hear of anybody talking about projects smaller than maybe 3 megawatts, which would be about 15 acres. And that's usually in the context of what we would call a community solar project. And that's, in this region of the country, that's usually a municipal or a electric cooperative utility that's trying to do a project that they can share the benefits with their members. Because those utilities, as you know, the municipal utility, the citizens own it, and then the co-op, the members own it. And so they have a slightly different structure in how they price things out, and they have a lot of customers that want this kind of stuff too, and are even maybe willing to pay a little bit more for it. We're doing a lot of work right now at our center trying to figure out how to make low-income customers in munis and co-ops benefit from solar projects. So, for example, they have to pay bill assistance. You know, every month those utilities have certain customers where people can't afford to pay their bill. Well, if you took that money and instead of just dumping it into paying the bill, and instead we bought a solar panel to start paying to provide electricity that we don't have to pay fuel for that person, maybe you can build up enough solar to actually reduce the cost of servicing those customers that can't pay their own bills. You know, it's a wrinkle that we're looking at. We're looking at a bunch of other wrinkles along those lines, but we're trying to find ways to make solar more accessible to a wider range of folks. A lot of times the criticism for solar for years was, you know, rich people can do solar and nobody else can afford it. Solar's gotten so cheap today that that's not the case anymore, but you do have to be creative in how you finance it and how you put the projects together. And community solar is one of the things that people are talking about to try and really make that happen for other communities that might have been left out before.
Steve mentioned earlier that the standard contract that used to exist in North Carolina, that was 5 megawatts in 15 years. So basically, Duke Energy would sign a contract with you, no questions asked, for five megawatts, 15 years. All of that changed with House Bill 589. So now the economies of scale are getting bigger and bigger, and we're looking at average 20 to 70 megawatt solar farms. I had lunch with one of our developer members last week. He said they're not talking to anybody with less than 150 acres right now. Yeah. So that's
And one of the reasons is because they have to connect to the grid, right? You have to get the transmission line there
Right.
to get to the grid to make it profitable.
Well, and so what happens is you build bigger projects because if you can't find a place to build it, I mean, these days, when you build a 20 megawatt project, you're not just building your own transmission lines anymore, you're building a substation.
Right.
You know, that's a lot of money to build a substation, and you're building that as part of the project.
Right, it has to be at a scale where you can move it to the customer
Exactly.
at a cost that you're making a profit on.
Right.
And and having, no offense, having the mom and pop farm solar stand is not gonna be profitable for, in this case, Duke Energy or any other big electrical company or power company, because it's not there for them to
Yeah.
run the lines and get the easements
I-
and pay people.
I would argue that it may still be cost effective, but it's not as cost effective as building a bigger one, and everybody wants to make more money, not less, so,
Right.
you know.
So is it unrealistic for us to put a minimum acreage on it, like 20 acres is vulnerable?
I wouldn't put a minimum on it.
You put a maximum?
I would try to avoid putting a maximum on it. Again, that's a discussion that you handle with other things, right? Why handle that in the solar ordinance? Why not handle that in your discussion of how you would deal with land use in general? If somebody comes in with a large project, you have ways of having that conversation that already exist without dealing with it in some weird special solar way. Would be my suggestion. It's up to y'all, but
How does the regulatory side work on this? I mean, do they get a business license to do this, or is it
Yeah.
just like farming?
So there's a, I didn't bring those slides with me, but there's a whole process that they have to go through that involves state permitting, there's local permitting, obviously they have to work with, you know, the zoning and that, there's construction permits. So it's an extensive process that the developers go through to do all of this. I have a list of about 17 different agencies, federal, state, local, that all wind up touching a project like this at some point.
Okay, then someone like us, Wesley Chapel or another one of these communities, once the CUP is approved, is there any, you know, permits that are still follow-up, like, you know, if it doesn't, if there's problems that we're unforeseen, like, say you want to go back and ask for a bond down the road because the delta's different, you know, is there anything you can hold over in that development, like a permit or like a license? I mean, is there anything?
Well, I mean, I think the conditions of your initial permit is where you would handle that. You know,
And after that, you're done?
and after that, you're kind of done, yeah.
Okay.
Now, the standard contract still exists per House Bill 589, but it's 1 megawatt, not 5 megawatts. So 1 megawatt is about 6 acres. So those deals can still happen, but you're going to see much, much fewer of those in lieu of the competitive bid process that is set up in 589.
And that 1 megawatt drops to half a megawatt after a certain number of done.
Yes.
It's basically done.
Yeah, it's pretty much covered.
So just, y'all heard about the model ordinance. Let me wrap up real quick with the slides. I know I've held y'all here way longer than you wanted to be here tonight. I apologize. But
You'd ask a lot of questions.
well, I work for the university. They pay me by the word. But, so this was just some of the groups that were involved in developing that model ordinance back in 2013, and you can see folks up there like the State Planning Association chapter was a major player in the discussion. The League of Municipalities, the Association of Counties, they were all part of this. A bunch of state agencies were a part of this. Duke Energy was a part of it. You know, we didn't leave a lot of rocks unturned in trying to do this, and we will convene a similar group when we go through our update process to do this again. And if y'all are interested in staying involved or interested in keeping appraised of the situation, just make sure you get me an email before too long, and we'll get you added to the list for that. This is just the template, you know. And I guess the only thing I wanted to highlight on the table of contents, you see all the appendices. A lot of those are the myths. That's the stuff that we put together the first time around before we wrote these white papers to dispel all the things you didn't need to worry about. And we will be updating that and probably adding a whole lot of appendices because we've come up with a lot more myths in the last 5, 6, 7 years while we've been doing this.
Just one thing, you have a lot of that aviation notification. So if I'm the landowner and I'm gonna sell to the developer, it falls upon the developer to notify the aviation, to notify DENR, to notify if there's a stream
All of
or
that,
an invasive or a special protected creature or plant.
all of that is handled by the developer. That is correct. So you guys have the ordinance, so I'm not going to dwell on it. You can see that, you know, we made some suggestions on permit requirements. The one note that I made earlier about maybe you want to throw something in there special about schools and make sure you're a little further away from schools wouldn't be a terrible idea. This was our original suggestions on parcel line setbacks, which for solar, for wind, it's a little bit more controversial because you've got these tall towers that could conceivably have an ice throw or a fall. For solar, the setbacks are pretty minimal because there's not a lot of risk associated with it. We said the EMF's not an issue. There's not a lot of these things that can kind of come out of the site to worry about. I mentioned the storage study. That was another part of that House Bill 589. I'm part of the team that's doing the work to look at the storage issues for the state, to try and maximize the value of storage use in the state as a part of that study. We're going to have a draft of that study, believe it or not. I keep telling myself this is true, on November 1st. And we will have a final version to report to the state legislature on December 1st. And then I'm betting we're going to probably have a final version sometime in January. But we're going to have a final version on December 1st, because legislation says so. That website there is where you can find more information about the storage study process and what's going on that. I mentioned these community education workshops. If y'all want me to come down and talk with others in the community, county commissioners, landowners, this is something I like to do. I don't like the 3-hour drive I'm going to have when we're done here tonight, but I don't mind doing it. And I can usually find a way to cover the cost through the Energy Foundation or somebody to do it. So for policymakers, I'm always happy to come and talk and answer more questions. I can do it by email as well. Although I will tell you, I get about 300 emails a day, so please put something in all caps in the header that says, Wesley Chapel, you were there, answer my question, please. Because I just get a lot of email and stuff gets lost. Yeah.
I think the big thing that needs to come out tonight is specifically what's going to happen automatically when a solar farm goes on, and versus what do we need to specifically write in our ordinance. We talked about, you've already said it's going to have a fence around it. Well, then we don't necessarily have to put it in our ordinance. Right. It's got to have a fence because that's going to happen automatically.
Well, this is why we drafted that model ordinance, and I will tell you that the components of that model ordinance are really the things y'all need to be worried about. There have been, as I mentioned, the details of some of those items. Setbacks, something to think about. Storage, put a placeholder in there to amend that once we have more information about it maybe. But the major things that y'all would need to worry about, I think the ordinance actually does do a pretty good job of capturing the items that no one else is looking at, that you guys should be looking at. If you're interested, I can get you more information about what all the various state agencies are that they look at this as well. One thing that's been a point of contention, and I've never really gotten a very good answer, is exactly the process of who goes first. There's all these, the Utility Commission has to do its certificate of public convenience and necessity, and then you guys have to do your local work, and then all these state agencies, there's the state clearinghouse. Well, right now, there's not anything in the state clearinghouse that requires them to notify you that they've looked at it, and there's nothing that requires y'all to notify them that you've looked at it, and there's nothing at the commission that requires them to notify anybody of anything, because I think they live, in their own kingdom. And so I wish, and what usually happens is the developer closes that gap, and the developer makes sure everybody knows what's going on. But it's not entirely clear to me that there is a statutory requirement for anybody to be telling the other legs of the stool that they've gone through their part of the process. I think actually if there is, it's that you guys have to have done yours in order for them to get a CPCN at the commission. But I won't swear to that off the top of my head.
Well, we have similar issues with developers that it doesn't come to the board, the planning board, until they've gotten 5 or 6 different hurdles crossed before it even comes to the planning board.
Right.
And they made it a rule that they don't want to see it until all those hurdles have been met.
Right. Well, and the other thing that used to happen, and Mike alluded to this, was we used to have a little bit of a problem with companies trying to come in and stealth these projects. They basically talk to the landowners, get everything all lined up, and then they just show up one day at a planning hearing and go, boom, here we got a project, and nobody in the community knew about it, and then at the next planning board meeting there was tons of fun because everybody found out about it. I think that process we've seen a lot less of. I think the development community in North Carolina is much more responsible than I think some other states that have had bigger problems on that front. And we're fortunate that we have groups like NCSEA and the North Carolina Clean Energy Business Alliance. You guys have a code of, it's not a code of ethics, it's a code
We have of a code of conduct.
Code of conduct.
Business code for our.
And so a lot of the developers are members of that, they sign that, and they act appropriately, which makes everybody's life a lot easier. So we're lucky in the sense that our state's got a more developed industry in a lot of ways than some of these other states where it's a little more Wild West.
Have you seen our draft ordinance?
Yes.
Yeah, I got it at about 4 o'clock on Friday, and I had a very, very busy weekend with an Eagle Scout project, selling biscuits for my church at the state fair and working at a poll as an early voting poll worker. So I saw it for about 30 seconds.
All right, let me just ask you real quick, a couple line items, right? I just
Okay.
wanted to see, get your guys' thoughts on this. Because really, this is one of the crux of, put pen to paper here and tell ordinance on this. One is, we're looking at adding this ordinance as essential services class, right? So we decided, let's have we have electrical, whatever. So we're gonna have one that's specific to solar generating facilities. Does that make sense to you?
Again, I always err on the side of, is it really different enough that it justifies it? I heard what you said earlier, and it does fit in a gap. I don't think it's necessary, but I don't necessarily think as long as the requirements that go with that are overly restrictive, then it's a problem. So I would say it wouldn't be something I would have done, but I wouldn't say it necessarily, and again, I am no longer speaking on behalf of NC State University. Let me make that real clear, because the university would have a cow. Just my personal opinion is that's probably, I don't think it's a problem, but I don't think it's necessary.
Okay. A couple other things we did, we setbacks. Again, this is just establishing this and kind of seeing how it goes. Before you can talk about setbacks a lot. Right now, we're suggesting 100 feet setbacks on all four sides. Is that correct, Shelley? Right?
Well, it varies upon the district.
Yeah.
We allow them in all the districts with 100-foot setbacks, I believe, in all.
So what you've got here behind you is the setback suggestions that are in the model ordinance, with the exception of the fact, again, that we had this one situation with a commercial business that had a side setback of 15 feet, and that commercial/business was actually a school. Those setbacks have worked pretty well. I have not seen a lot of controversy around those, unless you are abutting a residential neighborhood. And so that might be the one place where I might look to have slightly larger setbacks.
Do we have that?
It's part of the model ordinance,
Yeah.
so you should have it.
So I'm saying, you say it's 100-foot setback for any equipment, excluding the fencing.
Correct.
Now, how's that different than 30-foot if everything's starred?
One is from the equipment and one is from the fence line.
Excluding any security fencing. So you're saying the fencing has those setbacks,
Correct.
but then all the equipment is 100-foot.
Correct.
Oh, okay. I think that's what we're talking about.
Where the ball
I believe it. That's what we're saying, at 100 foot. Is that 100 feet setback from fencing?
That would be something.
That's what we have written right now.
If you have, I think you have written, if I saw it correctly, as 100-foot setback from the fencing, which is not what that is.
No, it's 100 feet setback from the property line.
Is where the fencing starts? Is that what we're
Yes.
saying?
The owner's property line, you have to be 100 feet, you have to be 100 feet
But is
back.
it the equipment that has to be 100 feet away, or the fence line?
Everything that has to do with that.
Everything, the 100 feet is the setback.
Okay, and so what we recommended here, and again, this was a recommendation from 2013 that 70 people in a room came up with, was that 100 feet should apply from the property line to the equipment, but that the fence is not part of the equipment. And that the setback from the fence would be these numbers here.
Okay.
I'm glad we had this conversation, because this is,
And you can reread that and make sure I said it right, but I'm almost certain I said it right.
And John, where that would compare is if you were going to fence in your property, you
Yep.
typically put your fence on the property line. You wouldn't have a setback for the fence from your property line, but you might have a barn or a shed or whatever.
that's true. I just wonder, can I put up a 6-foot chain link fence with barbed wire 10 feet from the property line?
No, we want it further back.
Right.
We don't, if you have a residential community, like he's saying, you had the private school and your setback was 15 feet. When you come out of your backyard, you're looking at an 8-foot metal fence.
Yeah.
That's not what you moved into the neighborhood for.
So I mean, I think
It's,
we can discuss that, but now I understand what you got.
Yeah.
But you're saying equipment's 100 feet in all four sides, same as,
That's what that recommendation is.
okay,
But again, these are the kinds of discussions you guys have to have.
right, okay.
One
The
thing,
other thing we're saying is, I'm sorry, go ahead.
you go right ahead, I'm sorry.
The other thing we're talking about is a minimum of 20 acres. You know, and again, this was, you know, when you look at 100-foot setbacks, well, you're already at 2 acres.
He was saying don't have mins or max.
He was, yeah.
I mean, so the problem with a min is how do you apply it? You know, if somebody wants to put a 1 kilowatt system on a pole mount in their backyard, does that apply?
No.
You
It
know,
would be
If
allowed.
it fed the grid, it would.
well,
For us, it would apply because now it becomes essential class 5.
so that's why I'd be concerned about min. The reality is, and as Mike alluded to, these smaller projects, these community solar scale projects will be smaller, and there is purpose still rules, those old rules do still apply for a 1 megawatt project for now, which is about 7 acres, and will apply continually for half of that, which would be 3.5, 4 acres. And so you could see those smaller projects emerge under those rule sets. And those could be utility scale or utility projects that are feeding a utility, not the house. When you get into projects that are feeding the house, and they're either on the roof or they're in the yard feeding the house, that's a whole nother conversation. And so I don't see a lot of reason for a min, because I think that's kind of naturally taken care of by the amount of property you got available.
So John, think about it this way, if a developer came to us and said, we want to do subdivision, the entire neighborhood of residential, but in the center is a community center, a pool club. And the pool club is going to have a solar panel to feed just the community pool. Do you want to make a minimum for that?
Well, that'd be allowed.
Well, that's what I'm saying. You know, I think the idea was here to differentiate that.
Right.
Right? So a class 5 essential service, when someone comes in, if it's 20 acres or larger, it falls into this. If it's something under that, then it is something else, right? That goes back to the threshold.
And
What's the
again,
threshold
I haven't
of
read this, so if the 20
one
acres
versus
is a
the other?
delineating mark, and you're gonna have an easier set of rules under 20 acres and a different set of rules over 20 acres?
Correct.
That may make sense. I'm sorry if I didn't
Yes.
understand. I thought you were putting a minimum on the
No.
size of the project, which made no sense. But
No.
what you're saying, I mean, that's not different, it's not much different than here. We defined, I can't remember how we defined it in here, but I think residential was defined at 20 kilowatts. I want to say commercial was defined at maybe either 500 kilowatts. It's in the model ordinance, but we set up delineations too for different sizes of projects and put different requirements, level 1, level 2, level 3, on the different types of projects.
Right, and that's what we're looking at is how much energy is this going to reduce? That's based on its scale right now.
Right, and if I was going to do it, I would probably do it. Would I do it based on energy, or would I do it based on square footage? I don't know. It's up to y'all. You could do it either way.
One thing I wanted to point out when I finished with the conversation there is one thing you may want to take a look at is the 60% of lot use restriction. That seems pretty restrictive, actually. And what is the intent behind that? If it's to buffer against neighbors, then consider accomplishing that through a setback. If you're concerned about impervious areas, then consider an impervious area calculation perhaps. But any developer is going to want to maximize that site, of course. So
Yeah, I just suggest you to And consider I alluded to that. that, I think, in the talk. Yeah. When you start using the sledgehammer to get at the thumbtack, which is kind of what those kinds of limitations are, you're usually doing that for one of three reasons. Either you're worried about pervious and impervious, you're worried about neighbors and therefore it's a setbacks conversation, or you're trying to discourage development. If it's the third one, okay, that's fine, that's one way to do it. If it's the other two, I would use the tools that are more commonly used for the other two.
Right, because you mentioned earlier, no developer of this thing is going to put that concrete, asphalt, or anything else. It's not cost effective.
Absolutely
Not even probably gravel, because that's not cost effective.
Well, no, they may use gravel. Gravel's
A little
pretty
bit.
common, but it'll be the big gravel that's easy to pick back up with the truck. And I mean, they want to make it as easy to get in and out as possible, and they want to do it at as low as cost as possible. And so, there may be gravel, but they're certainly not paving roads there to do that. That's not happening.
Well, if you notice, one of the other things we're doing here is we're saying that it's in all our districts available in our draft. And the reason is We have a very limited amount of commercial, first of all. Everything else is either R40 or R20. A little bit of agriculture here and there, but I mean, it almost doesn't make sense to pick and pull
Well, this,
out from what our community has.
and this is, you know, now you're new ground for me too, because it's a lot easier down east where there's nothing but ag land. You know, you guys have a lot of different competing potential uses for land here, and your job, frankly, is harder than it was down east, because you've got those competing possible uses to sort through. That said, the nice thing about solar is it's an easy one. You know, if you wait a little while, you can go and do something different if you want to. It's a lot easier to do that than it is with subdivision. Yes, sir.
I got a call from a citizen saying that they were concerned about dust from the ground under it. Is that an accurate concern? And if it is, what would you do to mitigate that?
I could certainly see dust being part of the construction phase, just as it would be with any construction.
Okay.
But once you have the project in place, the erosion control plan is going to deal with that. You're going to be, you know, it gets back to the discussion about native plants and clover or mowing the grass or whatever. There's going to be something there to prevent erosion, and so dust shouldn't be an ongoing concern once construction is
And we
done.
need to address that, or is the developer going to do that?
Well, the developer is going to do that, but that would be the kind of thing that wouldn't be uncommon to be seen dealt with at y'all's level.
Do you ever see the economics such that deforestation would happen to put these in?
Absolutely. There are places down east where, you know, there's pulp and paper land where they've done that. Now, it does not make sense usually to go after hardwoods, but, you know, in places where they've gone after, you know, pulp and paper stands that have been standing, you know, underutilized and unmanaged for years, we've seen that. Weyerhaeuser's been trying to do wind projects actually with some of the land that they own down east. You know, that's just basically idle otherwise, and it's got transmission lines running through it. So I would say it's not anybody's first choice, because in most cases you're adding a lot of cost, right? And so it's not the most commonly, but you know, if it's the right plot of land and there's a substation next door and there's a 3-phase transmission line running through the middle of it, I could see somebody asking the question. But I would say in general, it's probably not the first place people are going to look, especially for like hardwoods. But again, that's the kind of thing y'all would deal with that, right?
Right.
You know, to the extent that you can not ban things outright, but that you can put things in there and make people have to answer the questions as to why, and, you know, come up with some appropriate way of dealing with it, you know, that's the way you kind of maximize interest from a developer that makes you capture economic benefit without, you know, blocking it and sending them elsewhere.
All right.
I can't wait for all my developer friends to watch this and tell me all the things I said that made them mad. This is gonna be great.
Well, if you don't mind, I'd like to open up anybody in the audience with questions. Anyone else?
Just hit on all the points for me. I have a few questions here that don't relate to planning and zoning, but we were taking up more than 2 hours of this gentleman's time.
I think I've taken up more than 2 hours of y'all's time. I apologize. I really tried to do 45 minutes. It just never works out.
Well, a lot of it is us asking questions.
Which is fair, and that's why I'm here.
Yeah.
Just real quick, our website, www.nccleantech.ncsu.edu. We just changed the website yesterday, so there's some bugs in it, but it's new, but there's info there. Co-op Extension is that CES web address up there. They've got a lot. If you go to their website and just type solar in their search engine, you'll get a whole bunch of fact sheets on different pieces of the puzzle. The template ordinance address is there as well. I mentioned the Desire database, which you click on North Carolina and see all the incentives in the state from there. And believe it or not, that was actually my last slide. I finally got there.
I'm just applauding for the last slide.
After the football game this past weekend, I had to do something to restore NC State's good name, so I figured I could filibuster a little bit here.